We had been searching for the perfect camping spot for over a year. My friend Jason and I were tired of overcrowded campgrounds, noisy trails, and places that felt too close to civilization. We wanted something isolated, somewhere we could really disconnect. After months of looking, we finally found what seemed like the ideal place. It was deep in the woods, at least a half-hour walk from the nearest road or marked trail. A large cliff overlooked a slow-moving river below, the kind of place where you could sit and watch the water for hours. The air was fresh, the trees thick, and we hadn't seen another person all day. It felt untouched, like it was ours alone. We set up camp as the sun started dipping lower, making sure to secure our tent and firewood. With everything in place, we decided to explore the area a little before dark. We didn't plan on going far, just enough to get familiar with the surroundings. The forest was dense, but the sound of the river made for an easy landmark to follow back. As we walked, something caught my eye through the trees. A structure. It didn't belong there. We stopped and looked at each other, both of us uneasy. "What the hell is that?" Jason didn't answer, but we both knew we had to check it out. If someone was living this deep in the woods, we needed to know. We didn't want any surprises while we slept. We moved in slowly, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. The closer we got, the weirder it became. It wasn't a normal campsite. It was a shack, more like a makeshift teepee, built from scrap aluminum, sheet metal, and a tarp. It looked like it had been there for a while. Inside, there was an inflated air mattress. Wine and whiskey bottles were scattered everywhere, some still half full. That wasn't the worst part, though. There were stacks of magazines, porn, but not just regular stuff. We didn't take a closer look, but even from a distance, it felt off. Something about the place made my skin crawl. The air inside smelled stale, like old sweat and alcohol. There was no food, no sign of camping gear. No backpacks, no shoes. Just trash, booze, and filth. Jason whispered, "Who the hell lives out here?" I shook my head. "I don't know, man, but they don't want to be found." That's when I saw it. The campfire outside the shack. It was still smoldering. Someone had been here. Recently. We froze. Every horror movie I had ever seen played in my head. The person living here wasn't just some random hiker. This wasn't a campsite. This was a hiding place. We didn't say another word. We turned and walked, fast, back toward our campsite. As soon as we got far enough to be out of earshot, we started running. By the time we got back, it was nearly dark. My hands were shaking as I stuffed my sleeping bag into my backpack. Jason was already pulling up the tent stakes. We didn't talk about it, didn't need to. We just packed as fast as we could. The way back to the road was hell. We had no flashlight out, trying to move in silence, stumbling through the underbrush. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the bushes felt like someone closing in on us. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see a shadow moving between the trees. I don't know how long it took us to get back, but when we finally reached the road, we didn't stop. We kept walking until we reached Jason's truck. As soon as we were inside, doors locked, we just sat there, catching our breath. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, but we both knew what we had just walked into. That shack wasn't a normal campsite. Whoever stayed there wasn't just some guy roughing it in the woods. That person was hiding from something, or someone, and we had almost spent the night right next to them. Jason started the truck, and we got the hell out of there. We never went back, never even looked the place up on a map. We didn't want to know. Some places you just aren't meant to be. I tightened the straps of my backpack and took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. The trail ahead twisted up the steep hillside, switchbacks carved into the earth like scars. The forest around me was quiet except for the occasional rustling of wind through the dry leaves. It was late fall, and most people had long since stopped coming out here. I liked the solitude, but I also knew it came with risks. My dog, Sadie, padded ahead of me, her dark fur blending into the shadows of the trees. She was an 80-pound black lab, friendly to most people but always attuned to my mood. If I was nervous, she was on high alert, And right now, I wasn't nervous, just tired. I had been hiking since sunrise, pushing myself harder than usual. It was part of the reason I'd decided to do this solo trip. I wanted to test myself to prove I could handle it. Halfway up the climb, my legs burned, and my breath came in short gasps. I found a relatively flat patch of dirt off to the side of the trail and laid down, letting my pack rest beside me. The cold from the ground seeped through my clothes, but I didn't mind. The sky above was a dull gray, promising an early sunset. I needed to keep moving if I wanted to reach my campsite before dark. Sadie sat beside me, ears perked up, watching the trail ahead. That was when I heard the sound of footsteps, 2 sets, coming down from above. 2 men appeared at the top of the switchback, walking side by side. They looked to be in their late 20s or early 30s, bundled up against the cold, their faces slightly flushed from exertion. I lifted a hand in greeting, and they both waved back. Nothing unusual, just other hikers. But as they got closer, something about them made my stomach tighten. One of them, the taller one with a thick beard, glanced at me and then turned to his friend with a grin. "Oh, you're alone," he said, his voice light but carrying an edge I didn't like. His friend, shorter, with a hood pulled up over his head, chuckled. I didn't say anything. I just sat up a little straighter. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was just on edge from being alone out here. But I must have tensed because Sadie stood up, her tail stiff, ears pinned back. She wasn't growling, but her stance was enough to make a statement. The 2 men's expressions changed instantly. Their smiles disappeared, and they quickened their pace, walking past me without another word. I watched them go, my heart pounding harder than it should have been. They hadn't done anything outright threatening, but something about that moment felt wrong, like I had just avoided something bad without even realizing it. I stayed sitting there for a while, listening as their footsteps faded down the trail. Sadie stood beside me the whole time, staring in the direction they had gone. Finally, I exhaled and reached for her head, scratching behind her ears. "Good girl," I murmured. I didn't rest long after that. My break was cut short by the feeling that I needed to move. So I got up, adjusted my pack, and pushed forward, hiking faster than before. I wanted to put distance between myself and that moment. By the time I reached my planned campsite, the sun had nearly set. I had originally picked a spot near a clearing, a place with a good view of the valley below. But now, the thought of being out in the open made me uneasy. Instead, I found a less obvious place. A small, uneven patch of ground tucked between 2 large boulders, hidden by dense trees. It wasn't ideal, but it felt safer. I set up my tent quickly, my hands shaking slightly as the cold sank into my bones. I built a small fire, just enough to warm my fingers as I ate a quick meal. Sadie sat close, watching the darkness beyond the fire's glow. That night, I barely slept. Every sound in the woods made me flinch, and my mind kept replaying that moment on the trail. The way the man had looked at me, the way they had hurried away when they saw Sadie standing guard. I kept wondering what might have happened if I hadn't had her with me. By morning, I had made up my mind. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up quickly, eager to get back to my car before the loneliness of the trail got to me. I didn't see the men again. I never knew if they were just passing hikers, if I had misread the situation, or if something far worse had been avoided by pure luck. But as I walked the final stretch back to the trailhead, Sadie close by my side, I knew one thing for sure. I wouldn't be hiking alone again anytime soon. It was early November, and the chill in the air clung to my skin like a damp sheet. The sun had set hours ago, and the small country road leading to my parents' house was covered in a thick darkness, broken only by the occasional flicker of distant house lights beyond the fields. I was 17, walking home alone from a friend's place, something I had done many times before without a second thought. The road was familiar, lined with trees that loomed over me, their bare branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. There were no sidewalks, just a narrow strip of gravel and grass between the pavement and the fields. On one side, an open stretch of farmland, its tilled soil dark and lifeless under the moonlight. On the other, a dense patch of forest, tall pines and oaks standing like silent watchers. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the distant sound of leaves scraping against the ground. I had about a kilometer left before I'd reach home. My hands were tucked deep in my jacket pockets, my breath fogging up in the cold air. The only sound was my boots crunching against the gravel. I wasn't in a hurry, though I was aware of the stillness around me. The kind of stillness that makes you feel like something is just out of sight, watching. Then I saw it, a light. On the opposite side of the road, just beyond the tree line, a single lantern swayed in the dark. It wasn't a car's headlights, not a street lamp, just a dim, bobbing light, as if someone was walking through the trees, carrying it. I slowed my pace. I could see the glow of the lantern, but not the person holding it. Just the light moving slowly. My heart thumped hard in my chest. A hiker? A hunter? Someone out for a walk? None of it made sense. Nobody took this path at night, not in this season. There were no trails leading from the road into that part of the forest, just thick undergrowth and tangled roots. Then, suddenly, the light swung toward me, a sharp, deliberate movement. It pointed directly at me, shining straight into my eyes. I froze. The beam of the lantern held steady, blinding me for what felt like an eternity. My breath caught in my throat. I could see nothing beyond it, no outline of a figure, no details, just the harsh glare. The silence was deafening. Then, without warning, the light went out. Darkness swallowed the spot where it had been. I felt something cold rush through my body, a deep, primal fear that sent a jolt straight through my legs. I turned and ran, hard. My feet pounded against the road, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to know if someone or something was standing there in the trees, watching. The road stretched ahead, endless and empty. My house was close, but not close enough. My lungs burned, but I pushed forward, each step fueled by the purest terror I had ever felt. The fields on my left blurred past, and the dark mass of trees on my right seemed to close in. By the time I saw the faint glow of the porch light ahead, I felt like my legs would give out. The moment I reached the driveway, I darted up the steps, threw open the door, and slammed it behind me, my entire body shaking. I stood there, panting, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the house settling. Safe. But as I stood there in the entryway, something gnawed at me, deep in my gut. Who had been out there? Why were they shining their light at me? And worst of all, where did they go? It was early December, the dead of winter, the kind of cold that crawls through your layers and settles deep in your bones. The wind was light, but sharp when it cut through the trees. I was walking through the woods to my uncle's cabin, something I had done dozens of times before, but this time felt different. The hike wasn't long, maybe 40 minutes from where I parked my truck off the dirt road. The cabin sat at the edge of a frozen lake, deep enough in the woods that no one would stumble upon it by accident. I had a lantern with me, one of those bright LED ones, because last year I had slipped on some hidden ice and nearly cracked my skull open. This time, I was taking no chances. The trail was quiet except for the sound of my boots crunching against the packed snow and the occasional creak of branches under their icy weight. The trees were tall and dark, lined along the path like silent sentinels. I wasn't scared, just alert. There's always something unsettling about being alone in the woods at night, but I'd done it before. I knew these trails well. About 15 minutes in, I caught movement in my peripheral vision, a shape on the other side of the trees. I stopped. My breath curled in the cold air as I squinted into the darkness. It was hard to make out at first, just a figure standing still between the trees. No flashlight, no movement, just standing there. I lifted my lantern, shining it toward them. The glow caught on a figure, bundled up in what looked like a thick coat. A hood covered their head, and they stood stiff, arms at their sides. I stared at them, and they stared at me. They didn't wave, didn't say anything, just stood there, My stomach clenched. Maybe it was a hunter. Maybe just some other hiker heading back from somewhere. But why would they be standing there, watching me? I cleared my throat, thinking maybe I should say something, ask if they were okay. Before I could, they moved. Not toward me, just a slight twitch like a muscle spasm. A shudder, then still again. I felt an overwhelming sense that I needed to leave. Now, my fingers tightened around the handle of the lantern. I took one step back, and the crunch of my boot in the snow was deafening in the silence. Then, as soon as I moved, they reacted. They bolted, not toward me, but straight into the woods at a dead sprint. No hesitation, no stumbling, just an instant burst of movement, their feet silent in the snow. I didn't hear the usual sounds of breaking branches or heavy footfalls, just a soft whisper of motion as they disappeared deeper into the darkness. My heart slammed against my ribs. The cold suddenly felt sharper, like a blade against my skin. I turned and ran. Not a casual jog, not a fast walk. A full-speed sprint through the trees, my boots skidding slightly as I pushed forward. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if they had stopped running, if they had turned around, if they were following me. The trail stretched ahead, endless and unfamiliar despite having walked it so many times before. My breaths came out in quick, painful bursts, each one burning my throat. The cold air stabbed at my lungs. My legs ached, but I didn't slow down. By the time I saw the cabin's lights, my vision was tunneling from exertion. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, forcing them into the lock. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, then dropped my lantern onto the wooden floor. My pulse pounded in my ears as I pressed my back against the door, listening. Silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. I forced myself to breathe slower, to stop the shaking. My brain kept playing back the image of that figure standing motionless, then running like their life depended on it. Who were they? What were they doing out there? I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined them just outside the cabin, standing still in the dark, waiting. By morning, the world seemed normal again. Snow had fallen overnight, covering any trace of footprints. But even with the daylight and fresh snow, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been prey that night, that whoever was out there had seen me before I saw them, and I had no way of knowing if they'd see me again. I had always wanted to test myself with a solo camping trip, to see if I could handle the isolation, the silence, the dark. So, in the fall of 2018, I drove out to a remote stretch of the Blackwater River in northern Alabama. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the woods, and the water. I hiked about 5 miles in from the trailhead, far enough that I wouldn't see another soul. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, and the sound of the river was the only thing breaking the silence. I found a clearing near the water, strung up my hammock between 2 sturdy oaks, and built a small fire. The air was crisp, just cold enough to make the fire feel like a necessity rather than a luxury. Dinner was simple: some dehydrated beef stew, a protein bar, and a small flask of whiskey to keep me warm. As the sun dipped behind the trees, I sat by the fire, enjoying the absolute stillness. No cars, no voices, no distractions. Just the occasional rustling of leaves as the wind pushed through the branches. By 10 o'clock, the fire had died down to glowing embers, and I crawled into my hammock, cocooning myself in my sleeping bag. I wasn't scared, not yet. I'd grown up hunting with my dad and knew how to handle myself in the woods. I drifted off to sleep, listening to the rhythmic sound of the river flowing past. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when I felt my hammock shake violently. My first thought was that the wind had picked up, but then I heard it, scratching, scrambling. Something was pulling at my boot laces. I jolted upright, heart hammering. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out of the hammock, only to be met with the beady eyes of a fat raccoon clutching my boot in its tiny hands like it had just struck gold. We locked eyes for a moment before it darted off, disappearing into the underbrush. I exhaled, half laughing, half shaken. A damn raccoon. I secured my boots closer to me and tried to settle back down, but I couldn't shake the adrenaline rush. Every little sound suddenly felt amplified, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig putting me on edge. I must have dozed off again because the next time I woke up, something was rifling through my pack. I swung my flashlight around and caught another raccoon. Maybe the same one, maybe its buddy, digging through my food bag. The little bastard had managed to rip open the zipper and was pulling out my protein bars. I shouted, waving my flashlight at it, and it scurried away, but not before snatching one of the bars in its teeth. At this point, I was frustrated more than anything. I had hung my food bag from a tree branch, but apparently not high enough. I got up, stomped through the cold night air, and slung the bag over a much higher branch, making sure the raccoons couldn't get to it. Then, I secured everything else, boots, pack, anything remotely interesting to an opportunistic thief. I climbed back into my hammock and forced myself to relax, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The forest, once peaceful, now felt alive with movement. Every few minutes, I heard the soft padding of paws on leaves, the faint chittering of raccoons communicating with each other. I imagined them plotting their next move, waiting for me to drift off again. And sure enough, they kept at it. For the next few hours, it was a cycle of me hearing them approach, shining my flashlight, and watching them scatter. It wasn't fear keeping me awake anymore. It was pure aggravation. I was being outsmarted by a gang of woodland bandits. At one point, I gave up and just sat in my hammock, wrapped in my sleeping bag, glaring into the darkness. I could hear them out there, moving just beyond the reach of my light. It was like they knew my limits, knew exactly how close they could get before I'd react. By the time the sky started to lighten, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. The raccoons had finally given up, probably full from the protein bar they managed to steal. I groggily packed up my gear, making sure nothing had been ruined. My food bag was still intact, but I found tiny claw marks on my pack and some wrappers strewn around my campsite. I hiked back to my truck, exhausted and irritated. I had come out here expecting solitude, maybe even some deep, introspective moments. Instead, I had spent the night waging war against a group of relentless trash pandas. As I drove home, I couldn't help but laugh. Lesson learned, don't underestimate the wilderness, even when the biggest threat isn't a bear or a coyote, but a handful of mischievous raccoons. And for the love of all things holy, don't leave your boots where they can reach them. I was 17 the winter this happened, old enough to know better but young enough to take risks without really thinking them through. It was early February, one of those brutally cold nights where the sky was so clear you could see every star, and the moon shone bright enough to cast sharp shadows. I was coming home late from a party, riding my old snowmobile along the trails that wound through the dense northern forest. The cold bit through my jacket, the kind of deep cold that settles into your bones and doesn't let go. My hands were stiff inside my gloves, and I could barely feel my fingers wrapped around the throttle. But I knew these trails like the back of my hand. I had ridden them 100 times before, in every kind of weather. I knew every bend, every dip, every tree that leaned a little too far over the trail. The party had been nothing special. A few beers, some loud music, a bunch of us crammed into someone's garage, huddled close to the heater. I wasn't drunk, not really, but I'd had just enough to make me a little sluggish, a little slow. The snow under my sled was packed hard, the cold making it almost glassy. I picked up speed, my breath fogging inside my helmet as I weaved between the poplars and spruces that lined the trail. I was heading toward the river. It was always frozen solid this time of year, a thick sheet of ice strong enough to hold a truck. The trail narrowed as I approached the river, the trees closing in tighter. I knew this section well, it was a straight shot to the river crossing. But then, just as I rounded a bend, something enormous stepped onto the trail ahead of me. A moose. It was massive, its dark fur silvered by the moonlight. It stood right in my path, towering over me, its breath steaming in the cold air. I reacted purely on instinct, yanking hard on the brake. The sled skidded, fishtailing wildly before coming to a stop just inches from the animal. My heart hammered in my chest as I stared up at it. And then it was gone, just like that. No crashing into the trees, no sound of branches snapping as it moved away. Nothing. I blinked, my breath coming in ragged bursts. I swung my head around, scanning the woods. There was nothing there. No moose, no tracks. I told myself I was just tired, that the shadows had played tricks on me. But then I looked ahead. The river was open, not frozen, not a solid sheet of ice like it should have been. Just black, frigid water, flowing sluggishly under the pale moonlight. Had I not stopped, I would have hit that open water at full speed. My sled was too small, too slow to skip across it. I would have gone under, sucked into the freezing current, weighed down by my heavy winter gear. At best, I would have been fighting to climb out, alone in the dark, in temperatures so cold my wet clothes would freeze solid before I could even think of getting back on my sled. At worst, well, I wouldn't have lasted long. No one would have found me until spring. I sat there for a long time, my breath shaking, my hands gripping the handlebars so tightly my knuckles ached. The moose, if there had ever been a moose, had saved my life. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. There had been no sound, no movement, just a towering shape in the moonlight and then nothing. Eventually, I turned the sled around and headed back the way I had come. I found another route home, sticking to the tree line, staying as far from the river as I could. I never told anyone the full story. I told them I saw the river was open just in time, that I was lucky, that I stopped because something felt off. But I know the truth. That moose, whether it was real or not, saved my life, and I never saw it again. I was deep in the backcountry, miles away from anything resembling civilization. It was the summer of 1997, and I was on a solo hiking trip through the Absaroka-Beartooth Wilderness in Montana. I had been hiking for nearly 2 weeks, sleeping under the stars, cooking meals over a small campfire, and drinking from icy mountain streams. It was the kind of trip that people dream of when they want to disconnect from the world. That night, I had set up camp in a clearing by a slow-moving creek. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. I had spent the evening eating a simple meal of dehydrated beef stew and watching the last bit of sunlight slip behind the jagged peaks. The world was silent, aside from the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Sometime in the night, I was yanked from sleep by a noise that didn't belong. At first, it was distant, muffled, something I couldn't quite place. Then it came again, closer, sharper. Get in your car. Get in your goddamn car. My mind was slow to catch up with what I was hearing. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sat up in my tent, tangled in my sleeping bag. My headlamp cast wild shadows as I fumbled for the zipper. Outside, a park ranger was running through the campground, flashlight bouncing wildly in the dark. He was shouting again, voice ragged and desperate. Everyone in your cars now. Lock the doors. I was alone. No car, just my tent, my pack, and the thick, dark woods pressing in on all sides. I scrambled to pull on my boots, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. My brain screamed at me to move, to do something, but my body felt sluggish. Then, from somewhere too close, a sound split the night. A deep, guttural huff. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The noise was unmistakable. A bear. No, something worse. A grizzly. The ranger's flashlight beam flickered through the trees, landing on something massive just beyond my tent. My body refused to move as my mind tried to process what I was seeing. A bear? Huge. Its fur dark and matted. Its breath visible in the cold night air. It was standing over something on the ground. Something that had once been a person. The ranger saw it too. He stopped yelling. For a moment, the only sound was the distant rush of the creek and the heavy, wet breathing of the grizzly. Then, with a terrifying, raw power, the bear moved. It dragged the body deeper into the woods, vanishing into the blackness. The moment snapped. My body took over. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I sprinted blindly through the trees until I reached the ranger's truck. He was there, throwing open the door, pulling me inside. We sat in silence, the truck idling, our breath ragged. The radio crackled. More rangers were on their way. The bear wasn't secured. The woman's tent had been one site over. She never had a chance. Hours later, as dawn broke, I packed my gear and left. Years passed before I went camping again. When I finally did, it was in Idaho in the summer of 2003. A different trip, a different place, but the same wilderness. I had spent the weekend at a small campground near the Salmon River, away from major roads. I had been planning to stay another night, but something in my gut told me to leave. It wasn't fear exactly, just unease, the kind that settles deep in your bones. So I packed up my gear, loaded my van, and started driving out. I had barely made it 10 miles when the flashing red and blue lights appeared behind me. I pulled over, my heart picking up speed. I had no idea what I had done. The second my van stopped, a police officer was at my door. Before I could even react, he yanked it open and grabbed me by the arm. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, my face pressed into the gravel. I heard him shouting, felt the pressure of his knee in my back, the cold metal of handcuffs. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what was happening. Then, another voice, a different officer. He's clear, not the guy. The pressure eased. The officer above me hesitated, then stood up. He muttered something, an apology, I think, but my mind was still spinning. What the hell is going on? I finally managed to say. One of the officers, an older man with tired eyes, sighed. We thought he was in there with you, the guy from the campground. Who? My voice barely worked. He hesitated before answering. Murdered for people back there. Slashed him up with a machete. We thought maybe he forced you to drive him out. A cold, sick feeling settled in my stomach. The man had still been in the campground when I left. He could have picked any car, any person, but he hadn't picked me. I was lucky. Again, they let me go. I drove for hours without stopping, not until I reached a motel miles away, where I locked the door and sat awake until the sun came up. I still camp, still hike, still love the quiet of the backcountry, but I never ignore my gut anymore, and I never sleep easy in the woods. I was deep in the Ontario wilderness, hiking alone for the first time in years. It was late September, just as the air was starting to turn crisp and the days were getting shorter. The Canadian Shield stretched endlessly in every direction. Miles of dense forest, jagged rocks, and frigid lakes. This was true solitude. No phone service, no other hikers for miles, just me and the vast, untouched land. I had set up camp near a small lake, nestled between granite ridges and thick pine trees. The hike to get there had been brutal. My legs burned from hours of climbing over rocky terrain. My boots were scuffed, and my back ached from carrying my pack. But I was exactly where I wanted to be, alone in the wild. As the sun set, I got a fire going, cooked a simple meal, and settled in for the night. The air was quiet except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant call of a loon. The isolation felt peaceful but also unnerving. There's something about being completely alone in a vast, empty place that makes you hyper-aware of every little sound. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and let exhaustion take over. I drifted off to sleep easily, the quiet of the forest wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. Then, in the dead of night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was a dream, or maybe just that strange feeling you get when you know something isn't quite right. I lay still, listening. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint orange glow through the thin fabric of my tent. Then I heard it. Crunch. A slow, deliberate crunch on the rocky ground just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. The sound was unmistakable. Something was moving outside. I stayed completely still, listening. Another crunch. Then another. Whatever it was getting closer. At first, I told myself it was probably just a deer, maybe a moose, I had seen their tracks earlier that day, but something about the way it moved didn't feel right. It wasn't the heavy, lumbering sound of a moose or the quick, light steps of a deer. It was slow, careful, almost methodical. My mind raced. A bear? No, bears are noisy. They crash through the undergrowth. This thing was quiet, too quiet. Then I felt it, a gentle brush against the side of my tent. Just the faintest pressure, like something testing the fabric. I stopped breathing. My heart pounded in my chest so hard I was afraid whatever was out there would hear it. Another brush, then a soft sniffing sound. My mind was screaming at me to stay completely still, to not make a single sound. But I was also stupidly curious. I had to see what was out there. Slowly, carefully, I reached for the zipper of my tent. My fingers shook as I gripped it, hesitating for a moment before pulling it down just an inch. Then another, then another. I peeked through the tiny opening, my breath shallow and quick. Wolves, a whole pack of them. There were at least 6, maybe more. Their fur was thick and matted, their eyes reflecting the dying firelight. They were sniffing around my campsite, their noses to the ground, their bodies moving in perfect, silent coordination. One of them was just inches from my tent, its massive head lowered as it sniffed at the nylon fabric. I locked eyes with it for a fraction of a second. It barely reacted, just flicked an ear, then went back to sniffing the ground. I carefully zipped the tent back up, my hands shaking so hard I could barely do it. Then I curled into my sleeping bag, pulling it over my head like a child hiding from the monsters under their bed. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening to them move around my campsite. Sometimes they were close, sometimes they wandered off a few feet, but they never left entirely. Every time I started to think they were gone, I'd hear another crunch of gravel or the soft huff of their breath. I had read about wolves before. I knew they rarely attacked humans, but knowing that didn't make me feel any safer when I was alone in the middle of nowhere, trapped in a thin fabric shelter with an entire pack sniffing around me. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to just wait them out. Eventually, they would lose interest and leave. And eventually, they did. The first sign was the silence. No more crunching footsteps, no more sniffing, just the quiet hum of the forest at night. I stayed curled up for another hour just to be sure, then finally worked up the courage to peek out again. The fire had completely died. My campsite looked untouched, like nothing had ever happened. But I knew it had. The paw prints in the dirt proved it. I barely slept the rest of the night. Every little noise sent my heart racing. Every gust of wind, every rustling leaf, every crack of a twig sounded like another wolf coming back. When morning finally came, I packed up my camp as fast as I could. I had planned to stay another night, but there was no way I was risking it. The moment my pack was strapped on, I started hiking, not stopping until I was miles away from that spot. I never told anyone about it. Not because I was embarrassed, but because I wasn't sure what to say. It wasn't some dramatic, life or death encounter. They hadn't attacked me. They hadn't even really acknowledged me. But the feeling of being surrounded by them, alone in the wild, knowing that if they had decided to attack, there was nothing I could have done, that was enough to haunt me. Even now, years later, I still dream about it. I still hear those footsteps in my sleep. And every time I go hiking, no matter where I am, I always catch myself listening a little too closely, waiting for that familiar crunch of gravel under silent, careful paws. The mountains were always my retreat. I had been hiking and hunting these remote trails for over 20 years, and there wasn't much that could shake me. I had chased off bears, weathered brutal storms, and spent nights alone miles away from civilization. But nothing in all my years had ever terrified me like what happened that night in the Bitterroot Mountains of Montana. It was late September 2018. I had taken a week off work, packed my gear, and set out for a solo hunting trip deep in the backcountry. I planned to camp at a remote spot near a river where I had been a few times before. The elk were usually good in this area, and I had scouted fresh signs just a few days before. The hike in was about 10 miles, rugged terrain with steep inclines, thick timber, and not a soul in sight. Just how I liked it. I set up camp by the river, about 100 yards into the tree line where I was hidden from view but still close enough to fetch water. The air was crisp, the scent of pine thick in my lungs. After setting up my tent and securing my food up in a tree to keep bears away, I spent the rest of the day scouting. Tracks were fresh. It was going to be a good hunt. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, I cooked up a simple meal over my small fire, just enough to warm my bones before turning in. The night was dead silent. No wind, no rustling in the trees, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was perfect. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and lay back, listening to the stillness. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was awake. Wide awake, breathing, not mine, something else, something big. Deep, slow, heavy breaths. They weren't hurried like an animal sniffing around. They were deliberate, controlled, and they were right outside my tent. My heart pounded against my ribs. I lay there, frozen, trying to rationalize it. A bear? No, I had encountered bears before. They snort, grunt, shuffle around. This was different. It was just breathing. I reached slowly for my shotgun, which was always within arm's reach. My fingers wrapped around the stock, and I pulled it close, careful not to make a sound. My mind was racing. Whatever it wasn't moving. No footsteps, no rustling. Just breathing, deep and steady, as if it was waiting. I swallowed hard, took a slow, deep breath, and pointed the shotgun toward the sound. I didn't move. I didn't call out. I just listened. Minutes passed. Felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. Silence. I stayed like that for what must have been another hour, maybe longer. My muscles ached from holding still, but I didn't dare move. I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes. I just sat there, waiting for the first hint of daylight. When the sky finally started to lighten, I forced myself to unzip the tent and step outside. The air was cold, my breath visible as I scanned the area. Nothing. No tracks, no disturbed ground, no broken branches. It was as if nothing had been there at all. But something had been. I knew it. I packed up my gear faster than I ever had before. I wasn't staying another night. Whatever had been out there, I didn't want to find out what it was. The hike back felt longer. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the brush had me on edge. I gripped my shotgun tighter, scanning the trees constantly. I had never felt fear like that before. Not in the woods, not where I had always felt at home. I reached my truck by early afternoon, threw my gear in the back, and got the hell out of there. I didn't tell anyone about it for a long time. Not because I thought they wouldn't believe me, but because I didn't know how to explain it. I still don't. I've been back to those mountains since, but never to that spot. Something was there that night, watching, waiting. I don't know what it was, and maybe I never will, but I'll never forget that breathing, so deep, so deliberate, and so impossibly close. I've spent my whole life in the wilderness, and that was the only time I ever truly felt like prey. Years ago, I took a solo hiking and camping trip to a remote coastal region in northern Alaska. It was the kind of place few people visited, accessible only by boat, and even then only at certain times of the year when the tides and weather permitted. I had always been drawn to the wilderness, the isolation, the raw beauty, and the challenge of being completely self-reliant. I set up camp on a narrow stretch of beach, the forest pressing in from behind me, and the open ocean stretching endlessly ahead. The air smelled of salt and damp earth, the waves rolling in a rhythmic crash against the shore. I built a fire, caught a fish for dinner, and watched the sun sink below the horizon in a blaze of red and gold. It was perfect, the kind of evening that reminded me why I loved being out there, away from everything. As darkness fell, I crawled into my tent, the sound of the tide easing me into sleep. The night was still, with only the occasional distant call of seabirds. I don't know how long I was out before something woke me. A deep, heavy breathing coming from just beyond my tent. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the waves. It was close, and it was big. At first, I thought it had to be a bear, but then my mind caught up with my fear. Bears weren't common in that area. In fact, there hadn't been a documented sighting in years. That realization did nothing to ease the pounding in my chest. My mind raced through possibilities. A moose? Unlikely. Person? Even less likely. And then the thought I didn't want to entertain crept in: Bigfoot. It was ridiculous, but in that moment, with my heart hammering against my ribs, it was hard to dismiss the old stories that had been whispered about creatures in the deep woods and along the shores. I forced myself to breathe evenly, to think. If it was an animal, my fire should have kept it at bay. But the tide had come in, swallowing the spot where my fire had been hours ago. The darkness outside pressed in, thick and unyielding. The only weapon I had was my flashlight. I reached for it with a trembling hand and clicked it on. The beam cut through the night, illuminating nothing but sand and the slow lapping tide. I took a breath, trying to steady myself. Then, the breathing came again, low and heavy, followed by a soft splash. My light swept the beach, searching, and then I saw it. A massive orca, its sleek black body rolling in the kelp, just yards from where my fire had been. Relief flooded through me so fast it left me lightheaded. My fear had been real, but the explanation was something beyond what I had imagined. Something incredible. The whale was enormous, its white patches stark against the dark water. It twisted and rolled, caught in some private moment of play or rest. And then I noticed more of them just offshore, their dark forms breaking the surface, barely moving. They were sleeping, drifting on the currents in the shallows. I sat there for hours watching them. The fear, the adrenaline, it all faded into something else, something humbling. I was witnessing something few people ever got to see. It was as if the ocean had momentarily opened its world to me, letting me glimpse something ancient and untamed. I didn't sleep after that, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to miss a second of it. The night stretched on, the sounds of the waves and the slow, rhythmic breaths of the orcas filling the air. And when dawn finally broke, turning the water to gold, they were gone. I packed up my camp that morning, leaving nothing behind but footprints in the sand. As I pushed my kayak back into the water, I took one last look at the beach, at the place where my fire had been, at the shoreline where I had spent the night wide awake, watching giants of the deep mere feet from where I had slept. There are moments in life that change you. That night was one of them. It wasn't ghosts or monsters, but it was something just as powerful, something real. And that was enough. I was 12 years old the summer my dad took me camping up in the deep backwoods of northern Maine. It was one of those places where the nearest town was just a handful of buildings with one gas pump and a general store that smelled like old wood and bait. We had driven for hours along winding dirt roads, our truck kicking up thick clouds of dust, until we finally reached the lake. It was massive and untouched, its surface smooth as glass in the evening light. The kind of place where you feel like the last people on Earth. Dad had picked a campsite right on the water, a small clearing nestled between tall pines and thick underbrush. We set up our tent, got a fire going, and roasted hot dogs over the open flames. The air smelled like pine sap and smoke. The lake stretched out dark and endless before us. There were no boats, no voices, no distant hum of civilization. Just the crackling fire and the occasional call of a loon echoing across the water. That first night, I slept hard. The kind of deep, dreamless sleep you only get after a long day outdoors. But in the early morning hours, just before dawn, I was jolted awake by a sound so loud and sudden that my heart nearly leapt out of my chest. A massive slap shattered the silence, followed immediately by a deep, echoing splash that seemed to shake the whole lake. I bolted upright in my sleeping bag, my breath caught in my throat. My first thought was a gunshot, or maybe someone hurling a huge rock into the water. A second later, another tremendous smack rang out, followed by another splash. The noise was impossibly loud, especially in the eerie quiet of the pre-dawn woods. Dad was already sitting up beside me, listening. I could barely see him in the dim light, but I could tell he was tense. My 12-year-old mind was racing. Was someone out there? Who else would be deep in the woods like this, making a racket in the middle of the night? It was miles to the nearest road, and we hadn't seen another soul since leaving town. Another smack, another explosion of water. My stomach twisted into knots. It was so loud, so unnatural. Then, finally, I heard it, the distinct, chattering call of a beaver. Relief flooded through me, but my heart was still hammering. Beavers, I would learn later, slap the water with their tails before diving under. It's a warning, a way to startle predators and signal danger. But at that moment, all I knew was that I'd just been scared half to death by a giant rodent. Even knowing what it was, it took me a long time to fall back asleep. The next few days were perfect. We fished, swam, and hiked through the dense woods, spotting deer and the occasional black bear print in the mud along the trails. The nights were cool, filled with the sounds of crickets and distant owl calls. By the third night, I'd almost forgotten about the beaver scare until something else happened. It was late, the fire was dying, and we were just about to turn in when we heard a rustling in the underbrush near our tent. Not the small scurrying of a squirrel or chipmunk, but something bigger, slower. The sound of leaves shifting, twigs snapping. My stomach tightened. Dad grabbed the flashlight and aimed it toward the noise. In the weak beam of light, something moved. My heart slammed against my ribs. Then, out from the brush waddled a duck. Just a duck. A very bold, very unimpressed-looking duck that stared at us like we were the intruders in its home. I almost laughed out loud, more out of relief than anything. It quacked once, then strutted right through camp, completely unbothered by our presence, disappearing back into the darkness beyond the firelight. The rest of the trip was peaceful, but I never quite shook the feeling of being watched. Maybe it was just the way the deep woods play tricks on your mind, how the absolute silence makes every little sound feel bigger, closer. Or maybe it was just my overactive imagination, fueled by too many nights reading stories about people who wander too far into the wilderness and never come back. Either way, by the time we packed up and headed home, I was more than happy to leave the lake behind. Years later, I still think about that trip. The slap of the beaver's tail, the eerie quiet of the pre-dawn woods, the bold little duck that made itself at home in our camp. And sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of some unexplained noise outside my window, I remember that feeling, the deep, primal kind of fear that only the wilderness can bring. I used to walk the trails at Redwood Creek Preserve every morning before work. It had become a ritual, something that grounded me before the long hours in a fluorescent-lit office. The air was always crisp, the scent of damp earth and pine needles filling my lungs as I moved through the winding dirt paths. Even in the early morning, there was always a comforting silence, broken only by birdsong and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I never thought much about safety. The preserve wasn't remote. It was a well-known spot with a large parking lot, a few picnic areas, and public restrooms. I wasn't the only person who walked there in the mornings, though it was rare to see more than one or two other early risers. I never felt unsafe. That changed on a Monday morning in early September. I parked my car in my usual spot near the entrance, pulling my hoodie tighter against the chill. The sun had barely started to rise, casting an orange-pink glow on the horizon. I locked my car, did a few stretches, and started my walk. The trail I took was my favorite, a 3-mile loop that wound through thick woods, crossed a small creek, and then led back to the parking lot. I had walked it hundreds of times, felt familiar, safe. About 10 minutes in, I noticed a man further down the path. At first, I thought nothing of it. Plenty of people walked here. But as I kept going, something about him made me uneasy. He wasn't jogging or even walking at a normal pace. Instead, he moved at an oddly slow, deliberate pace. He was dressed in dark clothes, a hoodie pulled up over his head. His posture was stiff, his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides. I couldn't see his face, and I didn't want to stare, so I looked away and kept walking. I picked up my pace slightly, the crunch of gravel under my shoes growing sharper. A few minutes later, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced back. He was closer, much closer than he should have been, given how slowly he had been walking before. My stomach clenched. I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he had sped up after I passed him. Maybe he was just another morning walker, heading in the same direction. I kept walking. My heart was beating faster now, and I could feel a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with exertion. I knew these trails well enough to know that there was a public restroom not far ahead, near the halfway mark of the loop. If I could just get there, maybe I could collect myself and shake off this ridiculous anxiety. I walked faster, my ears strained for the sound of footsteps behind me, but the dirt path muffled sound too well. The only thing I could hear was my own breathing, coming quicker than before. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was letting fear take over. Then I looked back again. He was even closer now, too close. He was moving fast, but not running. His gait was strange, almost unnatural, like he was forcing himself to keep his pace measured, like he didn't want to scare me before he got close enough. The restroom building was just ahead. I didn't think. I ran. The second I broke into a sprint, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps pounding behind me. He had been waiting for me to run. I didn't turn around. I could hear how fast he was closing the distance. I reached the restroom and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut and locking it just as he crashed into it. The whole door shuddered under the force. The handle rattled violently, jerking back and forth as he yanked at it. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The small room smelled of disinfectant and old water, the dim fluorescent light buzzing overhead. He pounded on the door, hard, again and again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pull my phone from my hoodie pocket. I knew I had to call someone, anyone, but my mind was scrambled, my fingers fumbling uselessly at the screen. Then suddenly silence. The rattling stopped. The pounding stopped. I could hear nothing but my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I stood frozen, waiting, listening. The gap under the door was too small for me to see much, just a sliver of gravel and dirt. I strained my ears for any sound, any hint that he was still there. A minute passed, then another. Was he waiting outside? I didn't dare open the door. My stomach churned with dread. I sent a quick, shaking text to my coworker. Something's wrong. I think someone followed me. At the Redwood Preserve. In the restroom. Call someone. Seconds passed. Then a response. Calling now. Stay put. I barely had time to exhale before I heard footsteps again. But this time, they weren't coming toward me. They were moving away. Slow, measured steps. Then nothing. I waited and waited. 15 minutes passed before I heard another sound. This time, voices outside. A man's voice. Then another. A knock at the door. Ma'am? Park ranger. You okay in there? I unlocked the door and stepped outside. Two men stood there, one in a uniform, the other in jogging clothes. The jogger had been the one to call the ranger after noticing something was off. The ranger looked around, scanning the tree line. You sure he's gone? I nodded. I wasn't sure at all. The ranger walked me back to my car. The lot was empty now except for my car and his truck. No sign of the man in the hoodie. No sign that he had ever been there at all. I never went back to Redwood Creek Preserve after that. My morning walks ended that day, and I never found out who he was or what he had wanted. I was 16 when I went to a summer leadership camp in the mountains of Montana. It was a week-long program meant to teach us wilderness survival, teamwork, and leadership skills. The camp itself was miles away from the nearest town, deep in the forest, with nothing but towering trees, winding trails, and an old lodge that served as our base. It was the kind of place where the night swallowed everything whole, where you felt small against the vastness of nature. The first few days had been uneventful. We did our drills, our hikes, our skill-building exercises. Every night, we crawled into our sleeping bags, exhausted, barely able to keep our eyes open. It was the kind of tiredness that wrapped around you, heavy and deep, making the cold ground feel like a mattress. But on the second to last morning, everything changed. I woke up to the sound of someone yelling outside. Not just yelling, screaming. A desperate, frantic voice cutting through the thin morning air. My first thought was that someone had gotten hurt, maybe a bad fall or an animal attack. My tent mate, a guy named Eric, stood beside me but didn't say anything. "Stay in your tents. Everybody stay in your tents." The voice belonged to one of the camp leaders, his tone sharp with urgency. I had no idea what was going on, but I wasn't about to argue. I rolled over, pulling my sleeping bag tighter around me, figuring it was probably just a bear nearby or something. Bears were common enough around here, though we hadn't seen one yet. I let myself relax again, breathing in the damp morning air, the scent of pine and earth filling my nose. I could hear murmured voices from other tents, hushed whispers of confusion. Then everything went quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made your skin crawl. No wind, no birds, no distant rustling of branches, just a thick, pressing stillness. And then I saw them, shadows, two massive shapes moving between the tents, just beyond the thin fabric of mine. They were tall, impossibly tall, with thick, hulking bodies. My breath caught in my throat, and I forced myself to stay perfectly still. I could hear their footsteps, slow, deliberate, the sound of heavy weight pressing into the soft ground. One of them stopped right outside my tent. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then something pressed against the side of the tent. A deep, heavy indentation the size of my torso. I could see the shape of it through the fabric. A broad snout, sniffing, pushing against the thin material. A wave of cold panic washed over me. I could smell it now, that musky, wild scent. Not a bear. Not anything I had ever smelled before. The tent fabric shifted as the thing moved its head, sniffing, searching. I clenched my hands into fists, my body rigid, praying it would go away. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, it left. The weight lifted, the shadow moved, and I heard the slow, heavy steps retreating. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like forever. Eventually, voices started up again, quiet at first, then louder. Someone unzipped their tent. I forced myself to move, to sit up, to breathe again. When I finally unzipped my own tent and peeked outside, the morning light had fully settled in. People were standing around, whispering, pointing. A few feet away, the camp leader who had yelled earlier stood with his hands on his hips, talking to another leader in hushed tones. My eyes followed where people were pointing, and that's when I saw them. Moose, a mother and her calf, standing at the edge of the trees, their massive forms silhouetted against the forest. They stood there for a moment longer before disappearing into the trees, their dark bodies blending into the shadows. A nervous laugh bubbled up from someone nearby, and I finally let out the breath I didn't know I'd been holding. I had never seen a moose up close before, never realized just how massive they were. 8, 9 feet tall at the shoulder, a body built like a tank. The camp leader turned back to us. "That's why we told you to stay in your tents," he said, voice still edged with tension. "Moose are no joke." He wasn't wrong. That was the last night I slept soundly at that camp. Even though the moose had moved on, I couldn't shake the feeling of that massive presence just outside my tent, the way it had pressed against the fabric, sniffing, searching. I had faced plenty of things in the wilderness before. Storms, steep climbs, even a close call with a rattlesnake once. But nothing had ever made me feel as small, as vulnerable, as that moment in the tent, with nothing but a thin layer of fabric between me and something so much bigger, so much stronger, so completely indifferent to me. The rest of the trip went by in a blur. We finished our training, packed up, and hiked back out to the trailhead where the buses were waiting. But that morning stuck with me. Years later, I still think about it. That moment of silence, that shadow, that deep, wild breath just inches away from me. People talk about mountain lions, bears, wolves, all the things that are supposed to scare you out in the wild. But moose are on a different level. And now, every time I hear someone say they're not dangerous, I just shake my head and remember that morning in the tent, the sound of heavy footsteps, and the imprint of something far too large pressing against the thin fabric between us. It was the summer of 2017, and my friend Mark and I had planned a short camping trip just outside of Seattle. The campground was one of those well-maintained public sites, close enough to the city that we could still hear traffic from the highway if the wind was right. There were plenty of RVs, families, and weekend campers around. Nothing about the area felt isolated or wild. It wasn't like we had gone deep into the Cascades. We were practically still in civilization. The weather had been miserable all day. A steady, misting rain soaked the ground, making the campsite feel damp no matter how many tarps we strung up. By nightfall, the rain had finally slowed, but everything was still wet and cold. We built a small fire, but it struggled to stay lit in the damp air. Eventually, we gave up, crawled into my two-person tent, and settled in for the night. The sound of raindrops tapping against the nylon lulled me into a light doze. I don't know how long we had been lying there when the scream shattered the quiet. It was close, too close. The sound ripped through the trees, raw and violent, unlike anything I had ever heard before. I shot upright, my heart pounding. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Coyote, fox, raccoon? But I'd spent years studying wildlife. This was different, bigger, more guttural. There was something undeniably wrong about it. I turned to Mark. He was awake too, eyes wide in the dark. Neither of us spoke. The tent walls felt paper thin. We sat frozen, listening. Then, from across the lake, another scream. The same awful, gut-wrenching cry echoed through the night. Whatever it was, there were two of them. I strained to hear past the ringing in my ears, past the quiet patter of rain. The forest was silent now, dead silent. Even the constant chirp of insects had stopped. It was as if the whole campground was holding its breath. We didn't move. I don't think either of us even dared to breathe. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then, slowly, the usual night sounds crept back in. Leaves rustling, an owl hooting in the distance. The normal world returning, like whatever had made those screams was gone. Or waiting. Eventually, exhaustion won out over fear. I don't remember falling asleep, but I must have because the next thing I knew, it was morning. The sky was still overcast, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine needles. Everything looked normal, almost everything. The first thing I noticed was the dogs. Every single dog in the campground was on edge. Some were leashed outside RVs, but they weren't barking. They were hiding, tails tucked, bodies low to the ground. I saw a Labrador curled up under a camper, trembling. Another dog, a border collie, refused to leave the back of a van, staring out at the trees with wide, nervous eyes. The campers looked uneasy too. Conversations were hushed, and a few people stood around in groups, gesturing toward the woods. I overheard snippets of talk. Something out there last night. Never heard anything like it. Weirdest damn thing. Mark and I exchanged a look but didn't say much. What was there to say? We had both heard it. We had both felt that primal fear. And now, in the daylight, it was easier to push it aside, to pretend it hadn't been as bad as it was. We packed up our tent in silence. The air felt different now. Still heavy, still damp, but missing the weight of whatever had been there the night before. The dogs never stopped watching the trees. I caught myself doing the same. As we loaded the last of our gear into the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching us leave, waiting. To this day, I don't know what we heard that night. A massive cougar? Maybe. But cougars don't usually scream back and forth across a lake. And they don't send every dog in a crowded campground into a terrified silence. I've spent years in the woods. I know the sounds animals make. But that night, that wasn't something I could explain. And I don't think I ever want to. It was the summer of 2011, and my friend Jack and I had taken a week off from university to explore the remote wilderness of Western Australia. We were both 21, broke, and craving adventure. The plan was to follow an old bushwalking trail that wasn't well documented online. It was remote, hundreds of kilometers from any major town, nothing but dusty roads and dry, rolling hills stretching out for miles. We packed light, a couple of tents, sleeping bags, a small camping stove, and just enough food and water to last us the trip. We had our phones, but we knew reception would be non-existent. That was part of the appeal. It was just us, the land, and the quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing. The first few days went as expected. We hiked during the day, stopping to rest under the sparse trees when the sun got too intense. At night, we set up camp, ate, and talked until exhaustion knocked us out. The land felt untouched. No signs of people, no litter, not even footprints. It was exactly the kind of isolation we'd been looking for. But on the fourth day, things changed. We were navigating a stretch of land near the base of a low cliff. The rocks were reddish-brown, jagged, and weathered from centuries of exposure. Shrubs and dry grass clung to the rocky terrain. That's when I saw something that didn't belong. Plastic bag, tightly wrapped, partially hidden in the brush. I stopped walking. Garbage was rare out here. Hell, it was the first thing we'd seen that wasn't naturally part of the landscape. My first thought was that it had blown here in the wind, but the way it was tucked into the shrubs made that unlikely. Jack noticed me staring and wandered over. "What's that?" "No idea," I said. "It's weird, right?" He nodded. "Should we check it out?" I hesitated, but curiosity won. The bag was thick, the kind you'd get from a supermarket, and had been wrapped over itself multiple times. It wasn't light either. Something inside gave it weight. I carefully unwrapped the layers, feeling an odd sense of unease tighten in my chest. Inside, there were wallets, 5 or 6 of them, all damaged. Scuffed leather, broken zippers, worn edges. Some looked like they'd been out here for a while. The moment we opened the first one, I felt a shift in the air. There were ID cards, bank cards, student cards. All belonged to women. All young, late teens to early 20s. I swallowed. "This is bad." Jack was silent as he flipped through another wallet. The photos on the IDs showed different faces, but the pattern was the same. They were all from different parts of the country. Northern Territory, Queensland, Sydney. What were their wallets doing all the way out here? My mind raced for an explanation. Maybe climbers had left them behind. Maybe someone had found a stash of lost wallets and dumped them here. Maybe, but none of it made sense. The IDs should have had dirt and weather damage, but they didn't. As if they hadn't been here long. Jack cleared his throat. "We should take these to the cops." I nodded. There was no argument. We wrapped the wallets back up and stuffed them into Jack's pack. The mood had changed. The excitement of the hike had drained away, replaced by something heavier. We barely spoke as we finished the day's trek and set up camp that night. Neither of us slept well. The nearest police station was a 2-day hike back to where we had parked our car. We pushed harder than we had before, barely stopping for breaks. It felt like we were carrying something we shouldn't have. The weight of those wallets, those names, those faces, it sat between us like a ghost. I kept thinking about the girls. Where were they now? Were they alive? Were their families looking for them? When we finally reached the station, it was small, manned by only a couple of officers. We handed over the bag, expecting confusion, maybe even dismissal. Instead, the officer who took it barely spoke as he unwrapped the plastic. He went through each wallet carefully, his face darkening as he did. Then he looked at us. That look still haunts me. Not anger, not suspicion. It was something else. A deep, unsettling knowing. "You boys found this out there?" His voice was calm, measured. "Yeah," Jack said. "Near the base of a cliff. No other signs of people." The officer nodded, but he didn't look relieved. He didn't even look surprised. "We'll take it from here," he said. "Appreciate you bringing it in." That was it. No further questions. No, "We'll let you know what we find." Just a nod and a dismissal. We left the station feeling worse than before, like we'd stepped into something bigger than us, something we weren't meant to find. I followed the news for months afterward, but I never saw anything about those wallets. No missing persons cases, no updates, nothing. It was like they never existed. Jack and I never talked about it again. Not really. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wonder about those girls. Who they were, what happened to them, and why, out of all the places in the vast, empty wilderness, we found that bag. Or maybe it was never lost. Maybe it was left there for someone to find. And I still don't know if that someone was supposed to be us. It was the summer of 2004, and every weekend, my friends and I would meet up at Woodridge Park to play manhunt. We were a group of about 15, mostly teenagers, with a few younger siblings who tagged along. It was our thing. No parties, no video games, just running through the dark, hiding behind trees, in ditches, under pavilions, trying to outlast the seekers. The park was perfect for it, big and full of great hiding spots, with only a few streetlights dimly lighting the trails. We played from dusk until early morning, sometimes until the sky started turning blue again. That night, I was with my friend Josh and his younger brother, Adam. We had just finished counting off at the starting point near the park entrance. The others had scattered, disappearing into the darkness. The plan was always the same: start from the middle of the park, near the big pavilion, and work our way out. The pavilion sat at the top of a long, steep staircase that cut through the hillside, leading down to a winding path surrounded by thick trees and open fields. We moved quickly, jogging down the steps, whispering plans on where to check first. The air was still and thick, the kind of summer heat that lingers even after the sun is long gone. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and our footsteps on the concrete. About halfway down, we spotted two figures standing at the bottom of the stairs, right where the path split in two directions. Thinking it was one of our friends, I called out, "Hey, who's that?" Instead of the usual panicked scramble and laughter, a deep, aggressive voice shot back. "Who the fuck are you? That wasn't right." For a second, we just stood there, frozen. Then instinct kicked in. We sprinted forward, ready to tag whoever it was. We had the high ground, more speed, and a reason to chase. But the second we started moving, they did too, straight at us. The shift in energy was instant. This wasn't a game anymore. They weren't running away like any normal player would. They were charging straight at us. And they were fast. Too fast. Panic hit, cold and electric. We spun around and bolted back up the stairs. My legs burned, breath came short, and every hair on my body stood up. I didn't dare look back at first. I didn't need to. I could hear them, their footsteps pounding against the pavement, closing the gap way too quickly. We reached the top and skidded to a stop, desperate for a second to catch our breath, to figure out what was happening. That's when I made the mistake of turning around. They were there, 10 feet away, too close. I barely saw them in the darkness. Just two shapes, silhouettes against the faint glow of the streetlight behind them. No faces, no details, just dark figures moving impossibly fast. The space between us should have been more. We had a head start. There was no way they could have caught up that quickly. That was it. That was all we needed. We ran. We ran harder than we ever had before, straight for the park's outer trail, a looping path that led to the main road where one of our friends lived. It was our usual meetup spot between games, and right now it was the only place I wanted to be. The trail stretched for nearly 2 miles, twisting through trees and open fields, barely lit by weak, scattered lamps. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. Josh and Adam were right beside me, both pushing themselves beyond exhaustion. Every few seconds, I risked a glance back, and every time I saw them, still there, still chasing, never slowing down. I didn't understand it. We were fast, but they weren't falling behind. They weren't yelling, weren't calling out, just running, matching our every move. After what felt like forever, the trail curved sharply, opening up to the road. We practically collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for air, hearts pounding like drums in our ears. I looked back one last time, expecting to see them burst out of the trees after us. Nothing. The park was empty. The streetlights buzzed quietly, The road was still. No footsteps, no figures, no sound except our ragged breathing and the distant hum of crickets. The trail behind us was dark, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. They were gone. We stood there, bent over, hands on our knees, trying to process what just happened. Then, laughter. Not from us, but from up the street. Our friends. They were all there, sitting on the driveway of Matt's house, lounging around, drinking soda, grinning like idiots. I felt a mix of relief and confusion as we stumbled toward them, still catching our breath. "Where the hell have you guys been?" Matt asked, smirking. "We gave up on the game. Figured we'd prank you instead. Thought we'd see how long it took you to notice." Prank. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. We looked at each other, the realization sinking in. They hadn't been in the park. None of them. The whole time we were searching, they had been here, waiting. So who the hell had we just seen? Josh and Adam went pale. My stomach twisted into knots. No one in our group would have pulled something like that. They would have laughed, broken character, given themselves away. And none of them could run that fast. Some of the others laughed when we told them. A few wanted to go back and check it out. But we didn't. We were done for the night. I was done for good. I never played manhunt again after that. Never set foot in that park at night. None of us ever figured out who those people were. And honestly, I don't think I want to. It was the summer of 2014, and I was 21. My boyfriend at the time, Jake, and I had been dating for almost a year, and we were that kind of couple who couldn't keep our hands off each other. It was that stage where everything felt exciting and new. We loved adventure, which often meant long hikes, late-night drives, and, on this particular night, a little bit of both. We had spent the day hiking through one of the biggest parks in the state, the kind with miles of trails that wound through dense woods and opened up into wide clearings meant for picnics. Families came out during the day, but by sundown, the place was mostly empty. It wasn't exactly forbidden to be there after dark, but it wasn't encouraged either. That night, we weren't ready to head home just yet. We had parked in the gravel lot near one of the picnic areas, a little clearing nestled between the forest and a slow-moving river. The moon was out, casting just enough light to reflect off the water. It was a quiet night, peaceful. It was the kind of night that made you feel like you were the only two people in the world. We sat at one of the wooden picnic tables, talking in low voices, laughing at inside jokes, enjoying the stillness of the moment. And then, well, things started getting heated. Nothing crazy, but we were definitely wrapped up in each other. I was facing the river, my back to the trees, and he was facing me. From where I sat, I could see the way the moonlight shimmered on the surface of the water. From where he sat, all he could see was the darkness of the forest behind me. We were caught up in the moment when Jake suddenly went completely still. At first, I thought maybe he heard something, a branch breaking, a rustle in the trees. But then, in a low, steady voice, he said words that sent ice through my veins. "There's a man coming toward us." I froze. My mind didn't even process the words right away. I turned my head over my shoulder, and at first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then I saw it, a white t-shirt, just a white t-shirt, moving toward us at a brisk, steady pace. I couldn't see his face, couldn't see his hands, couldn't tell how tall he was or what kind of shape he was in. All I could see was the white t-shirt, cutting through the pitch-black tree line, coming straight for us. My heart slammed against my ribs. My stomach dropped. I didn't wait. I ran. I didn't ask Jake what he saw, didn't turn to get a better look. I just bolted. My feet hit the ground so fast I barely felt the earth beneath me. I ran like my life depended on it because, in that moment, it felt like it did. Jake was right behind me, his footsteps pounding against the dirt. We didn't look back. We didn't slow down. We ran straight for the car, our only thought to get the hell out of there. My hands fumbled with the door handle as I reached the car. I yanked it open, jumped inside, and slammed the lock down before Jake even had the chance to pull his door shut. He jammed the key into the ignition, hands shaking, and the engine roared to life. The headlights flooded the clearing. I braced myself to see something, someone, standing there, but there was nothing, just the empty picnic area, the dark trees beyond it, and the river shimmering under the moonlight. Jake didn't hesitate. He threw the car into reverse, tires kicking up gravel as we peeled out of there, leaving nothing behind but dust and panic. For the first 5 minutes, we didn't speak. My breathing was ragged, my chest tight, my hands shaking so badly I had to clutch my knees just to steady them. Jake's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Finally, he let out a breath. "What the fuck was that?" I shook my head. "I don't know." He swallowed hard. He didn't say anything. That was the worst part. He never spoke, never called out, never hesitated, never slowed down. He just walked toward us, fast and deliberate. By the time I had processed what was happening, he had been maybe 25 feet away, close enough that, if I had waited even a few seconds longer, he would have been right there. We never saw him again. We never went back. And I never stayed in the woods after dark again. Even now, years later, I think about that night, about the way the air felt suddenly wrong, about the way Jake's face had drained of color in an instant, about the way that white t-shirt just kept coming, silent and steady, with no intention of stopping, and about the fact that we never saw him in the headlights. I don't know where he went. I don't know what he wanted. But I know this: if I had hesitated even for a second, I might not have been here to tell this story. The trail was just wide enough for one person at a time, winding through thick pines, their branches heavy and drooping from the weight of the last rainstorm. I had been hiking for hours, the darkness creeping in faster than I expected. My headlamp cut through the night, illuminating the path ahead in a small cone of yellow light. But beyond that, the forest swallowed everything. It had started as a casual late evening hike with a few friends, just an idea to do something different while we were out camping in the mountains. The air was cool, and the quiet of the woods was oddly comforting, at least at first. We joked, took pictures, and wandered deeper along the trail until the trees seemed to press in on us, the sky disappearing completely behind their towering forms. The sounds started subtly. At first, it was just the creak of old trees shifting in the wind, the occasional flutter of wings as birds moved in the canopy above. But then came something different, something heavier. I heard it just over my right shoulder, beyond the reach of my headlamp. A snap, crisp and sharp, like a thick branch breaking under something's weight. I stopped walking. My friends ahead of me kept going, their voices growing quieter as they moved on. I turned my head slightly, trying to see into the trees, but my light only illuminated the trunks and the damp forest floor. Probably nothing, maybe a deer, a bear even, but I didn't hear it move away, didn't hear it run off like I should have. I walked faster to catch up with my friends, shaking it off. The night was playing tricks on me. The weight of the dark, the eerie quiet, the way shadows moved in my periphery. It all made my nerves hum with something I couldn't name. We finished the hike without incident, reaching the overlook where the lights of the town below blinked in the distance. The night was calm, and for a while we just stood there, breathing in the cool air, listening to the wind shift through the trees. It wasn't until we got back to the car that I felt that same creeping unease settle deep in my chest. My SUV sat exactly where I had left it, parked just off the dirt road near the tree line. But something was wrong. Even in the dim light from our headlamps, I could see them, marks, smudges, streaks of dust disturbed all over the vehicle's surface. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering. Handprints, footprints, long streaks where something had dragged across the windows and the hood. And they were large, larger than any of us. The fingers long, the palms impossibly wide. Some looked like they had been pressed deliberately, the patterns crisp against the layer of dirt on the car. Others seemed smeared, as if something had been gripping the vehicle, sliding along its surface. One of my friends swore under his breath, stepping back. "What the hell is that?" I reached out, touching one of the prints. The dust smeared beneath my fingertips, the mark fresh. Too fresh. We stood there in silence, scanning the darkness beyond the parking area. The trees were still, the night quiet. No wind, no movement, Nothing. Someone tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was a prank, maybe some kids messing around. But deep down, none of us believed that. It was too detailed, too deliberate. And even if someone had done it to mess with us, why hadn't we heard anything? We weren't gone that long. I unlocked the SUV, and we climbed in quickly, locking the doors behind us. I turned the key, and the engine roared to life, the headlights washing over the empty road ahead. We didn't stay to investigate. We didn't want to. As I drove down the mountain road, my hands tight on the wheel, I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something stepping out from the trees, watching us go. I never went back to that trail, and I never figured out who or what left those prints on my car. But I know one thing for sure. Something was out there with us that night, and it let us go. I was 24 when this happened, living in a small town in Ohio back in 2003. I worked at a little diner on the main strip, mostly evening shifts, and usually clocked out around 7. It was a quiet town, the kind where people left their doors unlocked, where kids rode their bikes until dark, and where nothing really happened. Most nights, I walked home the same way, cutting through a dirt path that ran behind the train tracks instead of taking the main road. It saved me a few minutes, and I liked the solitude. The trail was well-worn, a little muddy when it rained, but easy enough to navigate. During the day, joggers and dog walkers used it, but at night, it was empty. That night, though, was different. I had covered half a shift for a guy who called in sick, which meant I didn't get off work until nearly 11. It wasn't my usual routine, but I didn't think much of it as I wiped down my last table, counted my tips, and locked up. The town felt different at that hour, quieter, darker. Most of the stores had closed, their neon signs blinking off one by one. The few cars that passed barely made a sound. I kept my hands in my pockets, my breath fogging slightly in the cool spring air. I crossed the empty parking lot behind the diner and made my way to the familiar path. As I stepped onto the trail, the change was immediate. The trees on either side pressed in, their shadows stretching across the dirt. The train tracks ran parallel to my right, glinting faintly in the moonlight. I had never thought twice about walking this way before, but that night, I noticed how much the atmosphere changed after dark. The usual sounds, birds, distant traffic, the occasional rustling in the bushes were gone. It was just me and my footsteps crunching the gravel. I had walked about 5 minutes when I saw him. A man was lying on the ground beside his bicycle, groaning. The bike was standing upright, perfectly balanced on its kickstand. That was the first thing that struck me as odd. If he had fallen, why would he have taken the time to prop up his bike before collapsing? His groaning sounded exaggerated, like a kid faking a stomachache to get out of school. Low, drawn-out moans, almost theatrical. Something about it felt off. I slowed down slightly, but my gut told me to keep moving. As I stepped past him, he turned his head and called out, "Hey! Hey, man, help me." His voice was slurred, but not like he was drunk. More like he was forcing it, putting on a show. I glanced at him but didn't stop. "Sorry, man," I muttered, picking up my pace. The moment I turned toward the incline leading up to the railroad tracks, I heard it, shuffling, fast. Then his voice changed. It was no longer weak, no longer desperate. "I'm gonna kill you, motherfucker." The words sent a jolt through me. My body reacted before my brain could. I took off running, heart hammering in my chest. I could hear the sound of tires skidding, the clatter of gravel as he pedaled toward me. I was nearly at the top of the incline when I heard the telltale clunk of his front wheel hitting the metal rail of the tracks. Then a loud thud, a sharp cry. I stopped and turned. He had gone over the handlebars. His body hit the dirt hard, his bike tumbling beside him. This time, the moans were different, real, guttural, the kind that made my stomach twist. He rolled onto his side, clutching his arm. "Help!" he gasped. I didn't move, didn't say a word. I just stood there, breathing hard, watching him writhe. Then, slowly, I backed away, turned, and ran toward the gas station a few blocks up. I burst inside, chest heaving, and found the pay phone near the entrance. My hands shook as I fed quarters into the slot and dialed 911. "A guy just tried to jump me," I told the dispatcher. "He's hurt. Fell off his bike near the train tracks behind Maple Street." The cops arrived within minutes. I waited outside, arms crossed, my adrenaline still surging. When an officer finally came over to take my statement, he looked almost amused. "That idiot again?" he muttered, shaking his head. Apparently, this wasn't the first time they'd had to scrape him off the pavement. He was known around town for pulling stunts like this, pretending to be injured to lure people in before trying to rob them. More often than not, his plans backfired. The officer even chuckled as he told me the guy had been jumped himself more times than he could count for pulling this same stunt on the wrong people. "Did he have a weapon?" I asked, still shaken. "Nah," the cop said, smirking. "Just a big mouth." I didn't sleep much that night. Even knowing he wasn't armed, even knowing he was just some local idiot, the thought of what could have happened stuck with me. I had always assumed I was safe in that town, that nothing bad ever really happened there. That was the last time I took the train track shortcut home. From then on, I stuck to the sidewalks under the streetlights where people could see me, where I could see them, and I never let my guard down again. It was the summer of 2012, and I was 18. I had always been a night owl, preferring the quiet solitude of the dark over the chaos of the day. It wasn't unusual for me to take late-night walks around my neighborhood, enjoying the crisp air and the way the stars painted the sky. I lived in a small town, quiet and uneventful, where people felt safe leaving their doors unlocked and kids played outside until the streetlights flickered on. That night, I had been restless, unable to sleep. The air was warm, and a soft breeze carried the scent of damp earth and grass. I stepped outside, wearing a hoodie, shorts, and an old pair of sneakers. The streets were empty, just the way I liked them. I followed my usual route past the park, down a winding road that led to a small pond tucked behind a cluster of trees. It was one of my favorite spots. A simple wooden bench sat near the water's edge, and someone had tied a rope swing to one of the sturdier branches. Though I had never seen anyone actually use it, I took a seat on the bench, stretching my legs out in front of me. The night was clear, and the stars shimmered like scattered diamonds. I tilted my head back, breathing deeply, letting the stillness settle over me. It was one of those rare moments where the world felt entirely mine. A rustling noise off to my right shattered the tranquility. I froze, my heartbeat immediately picking up. I knew better than to ignore sounds like that. We weren't exactly deep in the wilderness, but black bears weren't unheard of in this area. My first instinct was to grab the flashlight I always carried in my hoodie pocket. I clicked it on and swept the beam over the trees. Nothing. The rational part of me said it was probably just a raccoon or some other small animal. Still, my instincts told me to stay alert. I kept the flashlight on but pointed it down to avoid blinding myself. My senses now heightened as I sat rigidly on the bench. I should have left, but for some reason I didn't. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the same dumb curiosity that always got people killed in horror movies. Whatever the reason, I stayed put. A few minutes passed. Nothing happened. The night returned to its calm state, and my nerves began to settle. I leaned back again, eyes drifting upward, letting the sky distract me. Then, in my peripheral vision, I saw something move. My entire body locked up. The movement had come from one of the trees near the pond, just to my right. My breath hitched, and I felt the unmistakable rush of adrenaline surge through me. It wasn't the wind. The branch had swayed slightly, like something had disturbed it. A creeping, rustling sound followed, soft but deliberate. My mind raced through the possibilities. A bird? A raccoon? Maybe an owl shifting on its perch? I didn't want to assume the worst, but my gut was screaming at me that something was off. The way the branch had moved didn't seem natural. I sat there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't dare move, didn't dare turn my head fully. Instead, I stared at the shape, trying to make sense of it in the dim light. Then I realized the shape hadn't disappeared. Whatever it was still there. Slowly, I gritted my teeth and forced my hand to move. My fingers tightened around the flashlight, my knuckles going white. With one deep breath, I lifted the beam and aimed it directly at the tree. A man was crouched in the branches. He was completely naked. His limbs were folded in an unnatural way, like a grotesque, oversized spider. His skin was pale, almost gray in the flashlight's glare, and his eyes, wide, unblinking, locked onto mine the moment the light hit him. He didn't flinch. He didn't react like a normal person would. He just stared. For a split second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. My vision tunneled. My ears started ringing, and the only thing I could feel was the blood pounding against my skull. Then he moved. His body shifted like he was preparing to climb down, one slow, deliberate movement at a time. That was all it took. My paralysis broke, and without thinking, I bolted. I launched myself over the bench, nearly tripping as my foot caught the edge. I hit the ground running, my legs pumping faster than they ever had before. My flashlight swung wildly in my grip, throwing erratic beams of light across the trees and path. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to see if he was following me. I just ran. I reached my house in what felt like seconds. My lungs burned. My legs felt like jelly, but I didn't slow down until I was inside. I slammed the door shut, twisted the locks, then went around checking every window, every door. I pulled the curtains shut and even shoved a chair under the doorknob for good measure. Only then did I allow myself to breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my room, my back against the wall, my flashlight clutched in my shaking hands. Every little noise outside made me jump. Every shadow seemed like it was moving. I half expected to look out my window and see him standing there, those wide, empty eyes staring back at me. But he never came. The next day, I tried to convince myself that I had imagined it, that my mind had twisted some ordinary sight into something horrifying. But deep down, I knew the truth. There was a man in that tree, a man who had been watching me, waiting, and that thought alone was enough to keep me away from the pond. Forever. It was the summer of 2009 when we decided to do it. The plan was simple. Hike to the top of Raven's Ridge, a small mountain on the outskirts of town, and watch the meteor shower. It was supposed to be one of the clearest nights of the year, and the peak would give us the perfect view. There were 4 of us, me, Ryan, Chris, and Jess. We were all around 17 and had been friends since middle school. Raven's Ridge wasn't a tough hike, about 2 miles to the top, but at night it was a whole different experience. The trail wound through thick woods, the kind that swallowed the light from our flashlights like a black hole. Every little sound felt amplified. The rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch underfoot, and the distant calls of nocturnal animals made the air feel electric. We were about halfway up when we stopped to catch our breath. That's when we saw him. At first, I didn't really process what I was looking at. A man, maybe in his mid-30s, walking up the trail behind us. That wasn't strange in itself. Raven's Ridge was a popular spot, but something felt off. He was wearing a business suit. Not hiking clothes, not even casual wear. A full-on suit with a white dress shirt, the top button undone. Ryan was the first to say something. "That dude's in a suit," he muttered, just loud enough for the rest of us to hear. Jess shivered. "Who hikes in a suit?" Chris laughed under his breath, but even he sounded uneasy. Maybe he's coming from a wedding? It didn't make sense. It was nearly midnight, and we were in the middle of the woods. No flashlight, no backpack, no indication that he was prepared for a hike at all. Just a man in a suit, walking steadily up the trail behind us. We picked up the pace. Nothing too obvious, just enough to put some distance between us. Every now and then I glanced back. He was still there, walking, not rushing, not falling behind, just keeping a steady pace like he had all the time in the world. We reached another clearing and stopped again. This time, when I turned around, he was only about 10 feet away, close enough for us to make out his features in the moonlight. He had short, dark hair, and his skin was pale, almost sickly under the glow of our flashlights. He smiled. Then he spoke. "You here for the meteor shower?" His voice was calm, friendly even, but something about the way he looked at us made my stomach twist. No one answered right away. Finally, Ryan forced a smile. "Yeah, just heading up to watch." "Mind if I join?" the man asked. It wasn't really a question. He was already walking again, closing the distance between us. What were we supposed to say? No? Tell a grown man he couldn't hike up a public trail? We let him walk with us. It wasn't like we had a choice. As we moved, I noticed something else. He was walking too close to Jess, uncomfortably close, close enough that she kept angling away, but he would subtly shift to keep near her, close enough that I could see her arms stiffen and her breathing quicken. I glanced at Ryan and Chris, and I knew they saw it too. We made it to the top. The view was breathtaking, the sky stretching endlessly above us, stars scattered like diamonds on velvet, but none of us could enjoy it. The man sat down almost right next to Jess, completely ignoring the open space around us. I saw the way his eyes lingered on her. It wasn't normal. Something was very wrong. I needed an excuse. Anything. "We should head back down soon," I said, forcing my voice to stay even. "Gotta get up early tomorrow." Jess was on her feet in an instant. Ryan and Chris followed suit. The man hesitated, his eyes flicking between us, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he just smiled again. "All right," he said. We started down, fast, faster than was comfortable on the rocky trail. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. None of us spoke. We just moved, putting as much distance between us and him as possible. Then I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, fast. I turned my head. He was running, full sprint, barreling down the trail like a wild animal, his suit whipping around him. And in his hand, where the hell had he gotten it, was a thick, gnarled branch. "Go!" I yelled. We ran. I don't remember breathing. I don't remember thinking. Just the sheer, primal instinct to move, to survive. The parking lot came into view. The car was there. We fumbled with the doors, threw ourselves inside. Jess was sobbing. Ryan was shaking. Then Chris, eyes wide, pointed out the windshield. He was still coming, sprinting down the last stretch of the trail, branch raised, eyes locked on us. I turned the key. The engine roared to life. The headlights flashed over him. His face, that same sickly smile. We tore out of the lot. No one spoke. The only sound was Jess's quiet crying and the pounding of my heart. 2 days later, Ryan sent me a link. A news article. A man had strangled his wife. Then, later that night, he had killed another girl. On a hiking trail. It was him. We never told our parents. Never went back. Never spoke of it again. But I still see his face sometimes. In my dreams. In the dark corners of my mind. And I know if we hadn't left when we did, if we hadn't run, I wouldn't be here to tell the story. I go out for walks late at night pretty often. I like the quiet. The streets are empty. The world feels still. And there's something peaceful about moving through it when no one else is around. I've done it for years, and I've seen some weird things here and there. Strange shadows, odd noises, people acting a little off, but nothing ever really stuck with me. That was until a few months ago. It was early September, the air still warm but carrying the first hints of fall. I left my apartment around 1:30 a.m., the same as always. I walked a few blocks, then cut through the back streets. The small town I live in is quiet at night. Just rows of dark houses. A few bars still open near Main Street, but nothing much beyond that. The occasional car passes by, but otherwise it's empty. That night, I wandered for a while, taking my time. I checked my phone at 2 a.m. time to head back. I turned down the same roads I had come from, taking the familiar route home. That's when I saw it. A black van rolling slowly down the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was just another vehicle. Maybe someone heading home late from work or coming back from a bar. But something about it felt off. The way it moved, crawling at a pace too slow to be natural, like it was watching for something or someone. It passed me, continued down the street, and turned the corner. I shook it off and kept walking, but a few minutes later, I saw it again. Same van, same slow crawl. This time, it drove by even slower, as if the driver was looking at me. The windows were tinted. I couldn't see inside. I tried to stay calm. Maybe it wasn't the same van. Maybe I was just overthinking it. But I started paying attention, my senses on high alert. I kept walking, my pace steady, acting normal. Then, about 10 minutes later, I saw it again. No doubt this time, the same black van. And now I noticed something else. It didn't have license plates. Cold knot formed in my stomach. This wasn't normal. This wasn't some random person driving around. This was intentional. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I picked up my pace, walking faster but not running. I didn't want to let them know I was scared. The van disappeared down the street, but I knew it would come back. I turned onto a different road, then another, hoping to throw them off. But just as I started to feel like maybe I had lost them, the van reappeared. This time it stopped. A few houses ahead of me, just sitting there. That was it. I wasn't waiting around to see what happened next. I turned around and walked the other way, forcing myself not to sprint. Then, as soon as I was out of sight, I broke into a run. I cut through side streets, zigzagging through neighborhoods. My heart pounded, my breath came fast, but I didn't stop. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see headlights coming around the corner. Then I saw a yard with a tall wooden fence. No lights on in the house. I didn't think. I just ran straight into the yard and ducked down behind the fence, pressing my back against the rough wood. Seconds later, the van rolled down the street. Slower this time, like they were searching. My hands clenched into fists, my breathing shallow. I watched through a gap in the fence as the van crept past. Then, just as slowly as it had come, it disappeared down the road. I stayed there. 5 minutes, 10, 15, 20. My legs cramped, my hands were slick with sweat, but I didn't move. Only when I was absolutely sure they were gone did I finally stand up. I didn't go straight home. I took a long, winding route back, checking behind me every few minutes. When I finally got to my apartment, I didn't go through the front door. I climbed in through my bedroom window, locking it behind me. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made my heart race. I kept expecting to hear a van idling outside, to see headlights shining through my blinds. But the night passed, and nothing happened. The next day, I told myself it was just some weird encounter, that maybe I had overreacted. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been hunted, that whoever was in that van had been looking for someone to grab. And if I hadn't been paying attention, if I had just kept walking like nothing was wrong, maybe they would have picked me. I still go for late-night walks, but now I carry a knife. I stay off the main roads, and every time I see a van, I take a different route home. I live in a small town in Oregon, the kind of place where the forest stretches out in every direction, swallowing up the land in thick green canopies and winding trails that have existed longer than the town itself. I've always been a night person, and ever since I was old enough to drive, I've spent my late nights hiking through those woods. There was something peaceful about it. The quiet, the solitude, the way the stars pressed in close when you found a clearing. Sometimes I stayed out so late that I got to watch the sun rise, filtering through the trees, casting everything in soft gold. Nothing had ever scared me out there before. The woods had their fair share of stories. People claiming to hear voices, see strange lights, the usual stuff, but I never put much stock in them. I knew the trails well, knew the way the trees shifted and creaked in the wind, the way animals rustled through the underbrush. I had never seen anything I couldn't explain. Until that night. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning, when I decided to take one of the deeper trails, the ones that twisted so far into the woods that you could almost forget there was a town nearby. I had been walking for about an hour when I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. It looked like a shanty town, right there in the middle of the forest, deep enough in that no one should have been living out there, were these little makeshift huts. They were built out of whatever material someone could scavenge: scrap metal, old bed sheets, wooden planks. Some of them were barely more than lean-tos, sagging under their own weight, while others had more structure to them, as if someone had put real effort into making them last. A fire was burning in the center of it all. It wasn't a normal fire pit either. Someone had taken an old tire and used it to contain the flames. The rubber had mostly burned away, leaving behind a twisted, blackened frame, but the fire was still going strong. It cast flickering light over the shanties, making the shadows shift and dance. But that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was that there was no one there. This place could have easily housed a dozen people, maybe more, but it was empty, and it wasn't abandoned either. There were clothes hanging from a line strung between two trees, a plastic cooler sitting next to one of the huts, the lid still cracked open like someone had just taken something out of it. A folding chair sat near the fire, positioned as if someone had been sitting there only moments ago. But there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just the fire and the empty shelters. I stood there for a long moment, listening, waiting. I don't know what for. I had this awful feeling in my gut, this deep, instinctive sense that I shouldn't be there, that I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. But there was also a part of me that was curious. I took a few careful steps closer, scanning the area, trying to make sense of it. The fire was too fresh for whoever had started it to be gone for long. But where had they gone? And why? I kept expecting someone to come back at any moment, to emerge from the darkness between the trees and ask what the hell I was doing there. But no one did. I crouched near one of the shanties, peering inside. There was a thin, dirty mattress on the ground, a few blankets piled up in the corner. A backpack sat near the entrance, the zipper partially open, revealing a bundle of clothes stuffed inside. It wasn't the kind of pack a hiker would carry. This was someone's home. I backed away, my skin crawling. There was something deeply wrong about this place, something that made the air feel too thick, too heavy. And then I noticed the footprints. The dirt around the fire was covered in them, overlapping, crisscrossing. Some were bare, others belonged to boots or sneakers. They all led away from the fire, deeper into the woods. All of them, not a single one returned. A fresh wave of unease rolled over me. It didn't make sense. Why would a whole group of people suddenly get up and leave their camp in the middle of the night? Why would they all go in the same direction, away from their fire, their supplies? And why hadn't any of them come back? I had the overwhelming urge to leave. Now, I turned and started walking back the way I had come, forcing myself to keep a steady pace. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I didn't want to make any noise. I didn't want to draw attention to myself, to whatever might have made those people leave in such a hurry. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement in the trees, but there was nothing. Just the fire, still burning, the empty shelters standing silent in the flickering light. It wasn't until I was well away from that place that I let myself breathe. My heart was hammering, my skin damp with sweat despite the cool night air. I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know who built that camp or why they abandoned it so suddenly. And I don't want to know. I never took that trail again, and I never hiked at night after that. When I was 20 and going to college in the Appalachian foothills of Kentucky, my friends and I had a habit of night hiking. We lived for the thrill of it, just being out there in the wilderness under the stars, where everything felt bigger and quieter. We knew the trails near campus well enough that they felt like a second home, even at night. Maybe that was what made me cocky. Too much familiarity, too much trust in the idea that I had control out there. It was late September, a perfect night. A full moon hung over the tree line, and the air was crisp but not cold, the kind of weather that makes you feel alive. I was a little stoned, enough to feel mellow but not enough to be stupid. I'd always liked doing things alone, and this felt like the perfect opportunity. A solo night hike, just me and the moon and the woods. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to one of the easier trails a few miles outside of town. It was a simple 1-mile loop, mostly flat, cutting through thick woods but never venturing far from the gravel road where I parked. Not exactly a national park, but still isolated enough that I never ran into other people there, especially not at night. I left my flashlight off as I walked. The moon was bright enough to turn the whole forest into a world of blue and silver. I could see everything: the outline of trees, the uneven dirt of the path, the scattered leaves that rustled in the breeze. It was peaceful, almost meditative. I remember thinking that I wished I had brought a camera because it was one of the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. That sense of wonder lasted for maybe 15 minutes. Then, just as suddenly as it had come, it was gone. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not just quiet, but real silence. The kind that presses against your ears, makes your breath sound too loud. No crickets, no wind, just me and the faint crunch of my boots on the trail. Then, somewhere off to my right, maybe 20 yards into the woods, I heard it. A man crying. It stopped me in my tracks. It wasn't just sobbing. It was something deeper, rawer. The kind of crying you hear when someone's lost everything. But there was something off about it. He wasn't just crying, he was almost babbling, muttering between the sobs in a way that made no sense. A high, thin edge clung to the sound, as if he were teetering on the verge of a scream but never quite reaching it. I can't explain why, but my body reacted before my brain did. My stomach clenched, and a deep, animal kind of fear took over. I wanted to help. I'm not the kind of person to hear someone in distress and walk away, but this wasn't normal. Something deep in me, some instinct I didn't know I had, told me not to move, not to breathe too loudly, not to let him know I was there. My hand was inches from my flashlight, but I knew I couldn't use it. If I turned it on, he'd see me, and I didn't want him to see me. I stayed frozen, listening. He kept sobbing, kept muttering, and I picked up pieces of it. Words that weren't words, just sounds strung together, nonsense syllables in between these awful, wet gasps. And then, between one sob and the next, he stopped. Just stopped. I don't know if you've ever experienced a moment where your body knows something before your brain catches up, but that's what happened. The second his crying cut off, every muscle in my body screamed at me to run. I turned as slowly and quietly as I could and started walking back the way I had come. The path was clear, but it felt impossibly long. I had never been so aware of my own breathing, of my own footsteps. Every step I expected to hear movement behind me, a rustle in the leaves, a footfall that wasn't mine. But there was nothing, just silence pressing down on me, making my skin crawl. I don't know how long it took me to get back to my car. Probably only 5 minutes, but it felt like an hour. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I kept expecting to hear him again, closer this time, but the woods stayed eerily quiet. When I reached my car, I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open, slammed it shut, and locked it in one movement. I sat there for a long time, hands gripping the wheel, trying to breathe. My pulse throbbed in my ears. The whole time, I stared at the tree line, half expecting him to step out at any second. I didn't see anything, didn't hear anything. Eventually, I started the engine and peeled out of there, gravel spitting under my tires. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I hit the highway. I don't know what I was afraid I'd see. A shadow in the road? A figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching? I don't know. Back at campus, I parked and just sat there, the adrenaline finally catching up with me. My hands were shaking. I kept trying to tell myself I had overreacted. Maybe it had just been some guy out there having a breakdown. Maybe he'd been drunk or lost or both. Maybe. But even now, years later, I don't believe that. I've never felt an ounce of guilt for walking away that night. Whatever was out there, whatever I heard, it wasn't right. It wasn't just some guy. I don't know what would have happened if I'd called out to him, or if I turned on my flashlight and let him see me, and I don't want to know. We weren't hiking, not really. More like car camping. We were way the hell out there, deep in the middle of nowhere on Bureau of Land Management land. This was in the summer of 2017, and we were in western Wyoming, far past where most people would bother to go. You had to take a Forest Service road for almost 2 hours off the main highway, winding up through thick pines and open meadows, until the road turned to nothing but dirt and rocks. We didn't see another soul the entire drive. There were 8 of us in 3 cars, 2 trucks and a beat-up SUV. We had planned to camp for 2 nights, get some fishing in, maybe hike up to an old fire lookout we had heard about. We weren't amateurs. All of us had camped plenty of times before. We knew how to be safe, how to clean up properly, how to make sure we didn't attract animals. It wasn't our first time out in the wild. By the time we set up camp, it was late afternoon. We found a good spot in a clearing, far enough from the road that we wouldn't be seen by anyone passing by. Not that we expected anyone. This wasn't a national park. This was real wilderness. No campgrounds, no ranger stations, just miles of open land and deep forest. The only sign that anyone had ever been here before was a half-burnt log and some old bullet casings near the fire pit. It was perfect. We spent the evening eating, drinking a little, laughing. Nothing felt off, nothing felt strange. It was one of those peaceful nights where the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the wind moving through the trees. We could see for miles around us. Any car coming up the road would have had its headlights cutting through the dark long before it got anywhere close to us. Around 10, we started getting ready to turn in. Some of us went to the cars to grab last-minute things. Flashlights, extra jackets, a couple beers for later. That's when we saw it. Each of our cars, each one of them, had a slashed front right tire. Not blown, not punctured by a rock. Slashed. A clean, precise cut, the rubber peeled open in the exact same place on each tire. Took a second for it to sink in. First, someone laughed, thinking it was a prank. But then the silence stretched. No one was laughing anymore. Panic came fast. I felt it rising in my chest like something physical, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. We were stuck. No cell service. No way to call for help. No way to drive out on 3 flat tires. Some person had done this, had come into our camp while we were sitting just 30 yards away and done this, and we hadn't seen or heard a thing. We scrambled to check our surroundings. Flashlights cutting through the trees, casting long, moving shadows that made everything seem alive. But there was no movement, no sounds beyond the usual rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Just darkness pressing in around us. We all had spares. Small, flimsy donuts, but enough to get us back to the highway if we moved fast. One of the guys had a gun, a .45 he kept in his truck for bears. He stood guard while the rest of us worked, hands shaking, fumbling with lug nuts, glancing over our shoulders every few seconds. Every shadow felt like it was watching. Every creak of a branch made my stomach twist. Took less than 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. The whole time, I expected something to happen. A figure stepping out from the trees. The snap of a twig behind us. A voice in the dark. But nothing came. We threw the ruined tires in the beds of the trucks and piled into the vehicles, cramming into seats, no one wanting to be left alone. The road out was rough, and those spares weren't made for this kind of terrain. We had to go slow, too slow. It felt like we were crawling, and every second that passed was another second that something or someone could be watching us. Finally, after what felt like forever, we saw the glow of headlights ahead. The highway, civilization. We pulled off onto the shoulder, got out, and just stood there for a minute trying to collect ourselves. None of us spoke at first. There was nothing to say. What could we say? That we had been hunted? Stalked? We called the sheriff's office as soon as we had service. They sent a deputy out and we told him everything. He listened, nodded, took notes. Then he said, "You were lucky. You were real lucky. That was it. No theories, no explanation, just that we were lucky." I think about that night a lot. About how someone, maybe more than one person, was out there watching us. How they knew exactly where to cut the tires. How they did it so silently, so precisely, without us noticing a thing. I don't know what they wanted. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't had spares. If we had stayed the night. I don't camp like that anymore. Not without cell service. Not without backup. And sometimes, late at night, I lie awake thinking about it. About those dark woods, and I wonder, was it just a warning? Or did we interrupt something before it could get worse? It was the summer of 2012 when my friend James and I decided to take a week-long backpacking trip through the forests of southern Oregon. We had both been hiking for years, covering trails from Washington to California, and felt more than prepared for whatever nature had to throw at us. We packed light but efficiently. A tent, sleeping bags, a small stove, water filtration, and enough food to get us through the week. The plan was to follow a trail that wound through the Cascades-Siskiyou National Forest, a remote and rugged region known for its towering trees, thick underbrush, and occasional encounters with wildlife. We had seen mountain lions. We had seen bears. Neither had ever made us feel unsafe. We carried bear spray, a knife, and knew the rules of the backcountry. We never expected the scariest thing we would ever see on a trail wouldn't be an animal at all. The first few days of our hike were uneventful. The air was crisp, the mornings cool, and the afternoons warm. We walked through towering pines and thick ferns, crossing creeks and climbing ridgelines that opened to breathtaking views of the valley below. We saw deer, plenty of birds, and even fresh bear tracks along the muddy parts of the trail. We made camp each night at designated spots, ate dehydrated meals, and talked about anything and everything under the stars. It was the kind of trip we had taken a dozen times before, the kind that made us feel alive. On the fourth day, we decided to stray from the marked trail. It wasn't reckless. We had maps, a GPS, and compasses. We knew our location. We just wanted to explore a little deeper, to see places where fewer people had been. The land was rough, climbing sharply at points before dropping into valleys so thick with trees that sunlight barely touched the ground. We were moving through a particularly dense stretch of forest when we crested a small ridge. From the top, we had a clear view down into the valley below. At first, I wasn't sure what I was looking at. The trees opened up just enough to reveal something that didn't belong there. Rows upon rows of what looked like crops. At first, I thought it might have been a small farm or maybe an old homestead. But as I looked closer, I saw the dark green of the plants, the way they were arranged in long, neat lines, and the glint of sunlight off plastic tarps and irrigation pipes. Marijuana, a lot of it. It was an elaborate grow operation, hidden deep in the wilderness, far from any road or marked trail. My stomach dropped. This wasn't some backyard garden. This was industrial scale, illegal, and well-maintained. My eyes scanned the area, taking in more details. Makeshift reservoirs collecting water from a diverted stream, camouflaged netting strung between trees, and narrow paths leading deeper into the valley. James saw it too. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. We both knew exactly what we had stumbled upon, and we both knew how dangerous it was. People who run illegal grow operations in the middle of nowhere don't do it casually. They don't set up something this large without protection. We were deep in their territory, and if they were here watching, they wouldn't take kindly to two hikers wandering through. We weren't supposed to see this. I felt a rush of adrenaline. Every part of me screamed to move, slowly, carefully, but quickly. I turned to James, and we both started backing up, trying not to make any sudden movements. My heart pounded in my ears. The forest, once peaceful and inviting, now felt suffocating. I strained my ears, listening for any sound, any rustling, any voices, anything that told us we had been seen. I didn't hear anything, but that didn't mean we were alone. We turned and began walking the way we had come, trying to stay calm, trying to keep our breathing steady. Every step felt like it echoed. Every snapped twig felt like a gunshot. We walked faster. Then we heard something distant but distinct. A voice, maybe two. We didn't wait to find out who it was. We broke into a run. Branches whipped at my arms and face as we tore through the underbrush. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out, back to the main trail, back to anywhere but here. My legs burned as we climbed back up the ridge, our packs bouncing with each step. I wanted to turn around, to see if anyone was behind us, but I couldn't. I just kept running. After what felt like an eternity, we finally reached the main trail. We didn't stop. We kept going, pushing forward, putting as much distance between us and that valley as we could. Only when we were miles away did we finally stop to catch our breath. My hands were shaking. James looked pale. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, he just muttered, Let's keep moving. We didn't camp that night. We walked until our legs couldn't carry us any farther. By the time the sun rose, we were almost back to where we had started. We never reported what we saw. We never told anyone until much later. The people running those operations aren't the type you want to cross. They're dangerous, they're ruthless, and they know how to disappear into the forest just as well as we do. I've seen mountain lions. I've seen bears. I've never been more afraid in the wilderness than I was that day. Because out there, in the deep woods, sometimes the most dangerous things aren't the animals. It was the summer of 2009, and I was 15 years old. My dad and I had gone on one of our yearly camping trips, this time choosing a remote campground deep in the mountains of northern Montana. It was a long drive from home, but my dad loved finding the most out-of-the-way spots, the kind where you wouldn't see another person for miles. It was just the two of us, no cell service, no distractions, just nature and silence. The campground was a simple clearing in the woods, right next to a large, still lake. During the day, the water was like glass, reflecting the towering pine trees that surrounded it. At night, the only sounds were the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. It was peaceful, isolated, a little unsettling. On the second day, my dad suggested we take a hike along the lake. He'd read in some old hiking guide that if you followed the shore far enough, you'd reach a hidden waterfall. There wasn't an official trail, so we'd have to blaze our own way through the thick forest. It sounded like an adventure. We set off in the late afternoon, the sun still high but beginning to sink lower in the sky. The hike was rougher than I expected. The ground was uneven, covered in fallen branches, moss, and patches of ferns. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The usual hum of insects and distant bird calls faded until all I could hear was our footsteps and the occasional rustling of the trees in the wind. About an hour in, we came across something strange. It was a slash pile, a heap of cut branches and logs, likely left behind by loggers years ago. That in itself wasn't unusual, but sitting right on top was a small child's shoe. It was old, weathered, and covered in dirt. My dad and I stared at it for a moment. It didn't make sense. There were no other signs of people anywhere around us, no trails, no campsites. Just this single, tiny shoe. My dad frowned but didn't say much. He wasn't the type to get spooked easily. Probably just washed up here in a storm, he said. But I could tell he didn't fully believe that. We kept moving, pushing deeper into the woods. The trees became denser, the air cooler. The sun had dipped lower, casting long shadows between the trunks. It was then that we came to a small clearing. My dad stopped and turned away from me to take a leak. I stood facing the opposite direction, looking out at the trees. And that's when I heard it. A child's voice, small, distant, but clear as day. "I'm over here." I froze. My stomach dropped. The voice had come from somewhere ahead of me, past the clearing, deep in the woods. I turned to my dad. He was looking at me, a confused expression on his face. "You say something?" he asked. I shook my head. "No." His face darkened. He zipped up his pants, and for the next 30 minutes we searched. We called out. We walked in widening circles, listening. But there was nothing. No response, no movement. Just the growing darkness pressing in around us. Finally, my dad sighed. "Let's head back." I didn't argue. We turned around and started retracing our steps. That's when we heard it. Something was following us. First, it was just small sounds. Twigs snapping, the rustle of underbrush. Maybe an animal, I told myself. But then the footsteps started. Heavy, deliberate, keeping pace with us. My dad didn't say a word, but I could tell he heard it too. He picked up his pace. So did I. The sky was darkening fast now, and the thought of being caught out here after sunset made my skin crawl. The sound of something moving behind us never faded. If anything, it was getting closer. We were nearly back to camp when my dad suddenly stopped and turned around, flashlight in hand. He scanned the trees. Nothing, just darkness and the shifting shadows of the branches. But I could feel it. Something was out there, watching. Without a word, We hurried the rest of the way back to our campsite. My dad stoked the fire, making it burn higher. We didn't talk much that night. I could tell he was trying to play it cool, but his eyes kept flicking toward the tree line. We left first thing in the morning, packed up and drove out before the sun had fully risen. My dad didn't suggest another hike. He didn't even mention the voice, the footsteps, or the shoe. And we never went back. Even now, I don't know what was out there. A lost child? An animal? Something else? I try not to think about it. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I swear I can still hear it. I'm over here. I was in my early 20s when I spent my summers hiking and bouldering with my friends in the wilderness of British Columbia. We were a small group of four: me, Ryan, Jake, and Emma. The place we frequented was a sprawling forest nestled deep in the mountains, about a 2-hour drive from where we lived. We had a favorite spot, a series of large boulders scattered throughout a valley, perfect for climbing and challenging ourselves. Most weekends, we'd drive up, climb until exhaustion, and set up camp near a small river that ran through the valley. It was remote, quiet, and a little eerie when night fell, but we never felt uneasy. The first few trips went as expected, climbing all day, laughing around a campfire at night, then waking up sore but happy. One summer, during our third or fourth trip to the same spot, something strange happened. Emma had left her rucksack and climbing gear just outside her tent before turning in for the night. In the morning, her boots, a few pieces of clothing, and all her chalk powder were gone. We scoured the area, convinced she must have misplaced them, but we never found any trace. We tried to reason it out. Maybe an animal dragged them off, or maybe she left them by the boulders, though we were all pretty sure she hadn't. We shrugged it off, convincing ourselves it was nothing. It wasn't the kind of place where you worried about theft. We rarely saw another soul out there. A year later, we returned. By then, the incident with Emma's missing gear had become an inside joke among us. We had no real explanation, but none of us seriously considered it had been stolen. This time, we arrived earlier in the day, eager to climb before sunset. We spent hours scaling rock faces, pushing our limits, and by nightfall, we were exhausted. We set up camp in the usual clearing, ate, and sat by the fire as the darkness pressed in around us. The wilderness was completely silent except for the occasional crackle of burning wood. At some point, I wandered off just beyond the firelight to relieve myself. I was maybe 50 feet from the camp, standing behind a thick tree, when I saw something that stopped me cold. Just beyond the edge of the firelight, where the darkness swallowed everything, a figure was lying flat on the ground. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I squinted, I realized someone. Some guy was sprawled out on his stomach in a full ghillie suit. His head lifted just slightly as if he had been watching our camp. My stomach turned to ice. I stood there, frozen, barely breathing. He must have realized I had seen him because, in an instant, he sprang up and bolted into the darkness. The way he moved, it wasn't clumsy or panicked. It was fast, controlled. He knew exactly where he was going. I didn't chase him. I didn't call out. I just stood there for a second, heart pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. When I finally snapped out of it, I turned and walked as calmly as I could back to the campfire, my mind racing. I didn't want to scare the others, but I also didn't know how to explain what I'd just seen. We barely slept that night. I never told them the full story until we were packing up the next morning. Even then, I kept my voice level, like I was just mentioning something weird that had happened. No one laughed. No one made jokes. We all knew, whatever I had seen, whoever had been watching us, had been there long before I noticed him. We never went back after that. None of us said it out loud, but we all knew the reason. It wasn't the stolen gear. It wasn't the eeriness of the woods. It was the sickening realization that we had never truly been alone out there. It was early morning, just before dawn, when I started my hike up a remote trail in South Carolina. The air was thick with humidity, a thin mist clinging to the trees, making everything feel damp. The woods were eerily quiet, only the occasional chirp of insects breaking the silence. I liked hiking early to avoid the crowds, but this morning felt different. A little too quiet, a little too still. But I ignored it, adjusting my pack and continuing up the trail. About half a mile in, my stomach cramped. That unmistakable, gut-twisting pain hit me like a truck. There was no ignoring it. I needed to go. Immediately, panic set in as I scanned my surroundings. The trailhead had a porta-potty, but it was back near the parking lot. I debated for a moment whether I could make it back or if I'd have to suffer the humiliation of squatting in the woods. The idea of exposing myself to whatever was lurking in the undergrowth wasn't appealing, so I turned around and started power walking back toward the porta-potty. By the time I reached it, I was in full crisis mode. I yanked the flimsy plastic door open, stepping inside and slamming it shut. The smell hit me immediately, hot, putrid, and thick enough to taste. The air inside was dense, barely breathable, but I had bigger problems. I dropped my pack, undid my shorts, and let nature take its course. Relief, that sweet, glorious moment of relief washed over me. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, catching my breath in the dim light. The only thing left to do was grab some toilet paper, clean up, and get back on the trail. I reached into my pack for my headlamp, flipping it on to find the roll. And that's when I saw it. A massive spider, easily the size of my palm, clung to the upper corner of the porta-potty. It was the kind of spider that looked straight out of a nightmare. Long legs, thick body, and an unsettling stillness. My breath caught in my throat. I recognized it immediately. A banana spider. Its web shimmered slightly in the light, stretching from the corner to the side of the door. I forced myself to stay calm. As long as I didn't spook it, it wouldn't spook me. Slowly, I reached for the toilet paper roll attached to the sidewall. But as soon as my headlamp's beam fully illuminated the spider, everything went to hell. The spider erupted into motion, scrambling wildly in tight circles, its legs flailing. My body locked up. My breathing stopped. My brain short-circuited. The only thought in my mind was, do not let it touch you. But that thought didn't matter, because in its blind panic, the spider launched itself downward, and it landed between my legs, inside my underwear. My body reacted before my mind could process what was happening. I jolted upright, knees slamming against the sides of the cramped porta-potty. My hands flailed uselessly, not wanting to grab at it but not knowing what else to do. A strangled sound escaped my throat, somewhere between a gasp and a scream. The spider moved. I felt it skittering, tiny legs tapping against my skin. Then, horror of horrors, it started climbing. My leg. There was no plan, no strategy. I exploded out of the porta-potty, bursting through the flimsy plastic door, my shorts still tangled around my ankles. My feet hit the dirt, but I didn't stop. I twisted, jumping, shaking, slapping at my thighs, my hands moving frantically over my skin. I felt phantom legs everywhere, my mind convinced it was still on me. My flashlight bounced wildly, illuminating the parking lot, the edge of the woods, the gravel beneath me. But I didn't care about anything except getting it off. And then nothing. I froze, panting, my skin crawling with imaginary sensations. The spider was gone. Had it fallen off in the chaos? Had I flung it away in my mad flailing? I spun in circles, scanning the ground, my arms, my shirt, my pack. Nothing. No sign of it. It had disappeared. My breath came in ragged gasps. I stood there in the early morning light, pants still around my ankles, drenched in sweat, my entire body trembling. My dignity, if I had any left, was long gone. After a long moment, I shakily pulled my shorts back up, still eyeing the porta-potty like it might lunge at me next. I knew, logically, that the spider was probably just as panicked as I was, that it hadn't meant to climb me like some kind of horror movie villain. But logic didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was never using a porta-potty again. With one final glance at the small plastic structure that had ruined my morning, I grabbed my pack and walked away, still twitching at every little tickle of wind against my skin. I didn't care how long the hike was. I was holding it next time. I was 13 when I found the poaching dump. Back then, I spent every free moment exploring the woods behind our house. We lived in the rural outskirts of a small town in northern Pennsylvania, where old logging roads and abandoned trails stretched for miles. I liked the challenge of getting lost and then finding my way home without a compass. One late afternoon in early fall, I went farther than I ever had before. I crossed a shallow creek, scrambled up a ridge covered in mossy rocks, and followed an overgrown path that I figured had once been used by hunters or loggers. The trees grew taller and denser the deeper I went, their canopies filtering out the sun so the forest floor was cast in dim golden light. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs sore but my curiosity pushing me forward. That was when I smelled it. The air shifted from crisp autumn to something putrid and thick. It was the kind of smell that clung to the back of your throat, a mix of rot and blood and wet earth. I gagged, instinctively covering my nose with my sleeve, but the stench was too strong to block out. Something was dead. A lot of somethings. I stepped carefully, my boots crunching on brittle leaves, until I reached a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep drop. Below, in a shallow ravine, was the source of the smell. A pile of deer carcasses, dozens of them. Most of the bodies were headless, their necks ragged stumps of exposed spine and flesh. Some were fresh, their fur still intact, while others had bloated and darkened with decay. Flies swarmed in thick clouds over the bodies, their buzzing loud in the silence of the woods. I could see small ones, fawns, mixed in with the adults. Some still had spots on their fur. I stood frozen, my breath locked in my chest. This wasn't the work of hunters. I knew plenty of them, and none of them would waste a kill like this. Hunters respected the animals they took. This was something else, something wrong. I had seen enough. My hands shook as I backed away, stepping carefully so I wouldn't slip on the loose dirt. I was about to turn and run when I heard the unmistakable rumble of a four-wheeler engine. Then another. Panic shot through me. I dropped to the ground and scrambled beneath the low-hanging branches of a hemlock tree, pressing my body into the dirt. The engines grew louder, and within seconds, two ATVs emerged from the trees, stopping right at the edge of the ravine. Two men climbed off, both dressed in full camo, their faces obscured by baseball caps and the shadows of the trees. One of them dragged two fresh deer carcasses off the back of his four-wheeler and tossed them onto the pile like garbage. The other lit a cigarette and took a slow drag before exhaling a cloud of smoke. They talked, but I couldn't hear them well over the sound of my own heartbeat slamming in my ears. Every muscle in my body ached from staying completely still, but I didn't dare move. I was maybe 15 feet away from them, hidden beneath the hemlock's thick branches. If they looked too closely, they'd see me. They stayed for what felt like an eternity. The one with the cigarette leaned against his four-wheeler, flicking ash onto the dirt. The other one wiped his hands on his jeans, smearing blood into the fabric. I tried to memorize their faces, but they were just shadows, just outlines. I had grown up in this town, knew every neighbor, every farmer, every hunter, but I had never seen these men before. Finally, one of them stomped out his cigarette. They climbed back onto their four-wheelers, revved the engines, and took off the way they came, disappearing into the trees. I stayed hidden for several more minutes, listening, waiting, my lungs burning from holding my breath. When I was sure they were gone, I crawled out from under the tree and ran. I didn't care about direction, didn't care about the branches whipping my arms or the roots threatening to trip me. I just ran. By the time I burst through the back door of my house, I was gasping, my shirt damp with sweat. My parents were in the kitchen, and I spilled the story out between frantic breaths. But they didn't believe me. "That's enough, Evan," my dad said, shaking his head. "You know better than to run off into those woods. Now you're making up stories." "It's not a story," I shouted. "It's real. There's a whole pile of dead deer down there. You're done hiking alone," my mom said, her voice sharp with worry. "You could have gotten lost. Or worse." I kept arguing, but it didn't matter. They were more upset that I had wandered so far from home than they were about what I had found. I stomped upstairs to my room, furious, frustrated, scared. The next day, I told our neighbor, Mr. Lane, about it. He was a serious hunter, the kind of guy who taught his kids gun safety before they could ride a bike. When I told him what I had seen, his face darkened. "Where?" he asked. I described the area as best as I could. He nodded, jaw tight, then said, "I'll let the game warden know." A few days later, I heard that the warden had gone out there and found the dump site. They investigated, but nothing ever came of it. The men were never caught. I stopped hiking alone after that. The woods no longer felt like mine. Years later, long after I had moved away, I came back to visit my parents and found myself staring at the tree line behind the house. For a moment, I felt that same old pull, the urge to explore. But I knew better now. Some places are better left alone. The summer heat was suffocating, the kind that made the air shimmer in the distance and made you question every decision that led you outside. It was August, and I had been living in this mountain town for a couple of months now. Fresh out of college, I had no friends here yet, and the loneliness had started to wear on me. So I hiked. I found an old herding trail in the mountains, a narrow, rough path that wasn't on any maps. I had stumbled across it once before while hiking another route and had mentally marked it for later. It ran alongside a stream, the kind of picturesque mountain water that looked straight out of a postcard. Lined with spruce trees, their needles swaying lazily in the warm breeze, tall grass along the banks shifting like waves. The trail wasn't an official one, not something a park ranger would direct tourists to, but that was the appeal. No crowds, no chatter, just me and the wilderness. The first mile or two was easy. The ground was soft with pine needles, the occasional root sticking out, but nothing I wasn't used to. I had worn long pants despite the heat, worried about ticks hiding in the grass. It didn't take long before I was soaked in sweat, my shirt clinging to me, my face damp, but the water ahead looked so inviting. The further I hiked, the more tempting it became. Eventually, I came to a bend in the river, far away from where any normal hiker would be. I doubted anyone even knew about this place. The water was crystal clear, rushing softly over smooth stones, deeper in some spots than others. That was it. I was going in. I stripped down completely, leaving my clothes in a heap near the bank. The second my feet hit the water, I gasped. It was ice cold, shocking in contrast to the heavy summer heat, but it felt incredible. I waded in slowly, my legs numbing as the water crept up my body. By the time I was waist deep, I could barely feel my feet anymore. I let myself sink lower, shivering for a second before adjusting. The cold was refreshing, waking me up in a way caffeine never could. It was perfect. Curiosity got the better of me. I wanted to see what was around that bend. The water was chest deep now, but I moved slowly, carefully, my feet feeling for solid ground beneath. I wasn't splashing, barely making a ripple. The air was still. The only sounds were the gentle rush of the stream and the distant chirping of birds. As I rounded the bend, my eyes scanned the area. A cluster of spruce trees, a large rock jutting from the water, another small spruce beside it. And then just past that tree, I saw it. A bull moose, massive, towering. It stood in the water, no more than 50 feet from me, its long legs partially submerged, its head lowered as it drank. Its dark brown coat was slick from the heat, its antlers impossibly wide, branching out like something ancient and prehistoric. The sheer size of it was unreal. I froze. My mind screamed at me, but my body refused to move. I wasn't sure if it had seen me. It hadn't reacted, but if it did, I turned, slowly as I could manage while panic coursed through my veins. Every muscle in my body was locked tight, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. My only thought was, don't make a sound. And yet, under my breath, barely audible even to myself, I whispered, I don't want to die. I don't know why I said it. Some kind of panic response. a desperate attempt to control the terror clawing at my chest. My feet found the riverbed, and I started moving faster, but still silent, stepping backward through the water, every step calculated, measured. My heart pounded so hard I thought for sure the moose would hear it. It didn't move. I kept going. By the time I was around the bend, hidden again, I abandoned all pretense of control. I turned and rushed to shore, water splashing around me as I moved as fast as my numb legs would allow. The second my feet hit land, I didn't even think. I grabbed my clothes in a heap and bolted, barefoot, naked, sprinting through the woods like a lunatic, twigs and rocks digging into my feet, branches slapping at my skin. The adrenaline masked the pain. My only thought was distance. Put as much distance between me and that animal as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I slowed. My lungs burned. My legs wobbled beneath me. I leaned against a tree, gasping for air, my pulse a deafening roar in my ears. That's when I realized I was still naked. My clothes were a crumpled mess in my arms. I forced myself to move again, shaking hands fumbling to pull on my underwear, then my pants. My feet were raw, scratched up from the forest floor. I managed to get my shoes on last, the laces loose, uneven. It didn't matter. I needed to keep going. I didn't stop running until I saw my car. It was still there, untouched, waiting like nothing had happened. I yanked the door open and collapsed into the driver's seat. My hands shook violently against the wheel, my breathing still uneven. I sat there for a long time, staring out the windshield, trying to convince myself it was over, that I was fine, that I had just experienced something that could have gone very, very wrong but didn't. Eventually, my breathing steadied. My hands stopped trembling. The fear began to fade, replaced by something else. Something ridiculous. Laughter. Started as a small chuckle, then grew, bubbling up uncontrollably. The image of myself, bare-ass naked, running through the woods like some kind of feral maniac, was suddenly hilarious. I laughed until tears pricked my eyes, shaking my head at my own stupidity. I had survived. By sheer luck, maybe, but I had made it out. It was a long drive home. I replayed the moment over and over, each time feeling a little more like it was unreal, like something that had happened to someone else. I never told anyone the full story, not for a long time, but that day stuck with me, and I never hiked that trail again. My wife, Emily, and I had been married for just under a week. It was 2016, and we were on our honeymoon in Costa Rica. We had planned the trip for months, both excited for the adventure and the escape from the stress of wedding planning. Neither of us had ever been to Central America before, but we'd heard stories of its beauty. Lush jungles, hidden waterfalls, exotic animals. Sounded perfect. On our fourth day there, we decided to go on a hike through a remote jungle trail. It wasn't anything official, just a path a local had recommended to us. He told us it would take about 5 hours round trip, leading to a secluded waterfall that few tourists ever saw. We liked the sound of that. It was exactly what we were looking for. An adventure, but not something too extreme. The morning was hot, the air thick with humidity, but the jungle was beautiful. Tall trees with twisted roots lined the narrow dirt path. Birds we had never seen before flitted between branches, their calls echoing through the thick foliage. We walked for nearly 2 hours, drinking from our water bottles and stopping occasionally to admire the view. It was then that we heard the scream. It was high-pitched, raw, and full of desperation. The kind of sound that makes your body freeze before your mind even catches up. Emily grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might bring whatever made that sound closer. I swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah." A second scream cut through the thick jungle air. It was closer this time. I felt a rush of adrenaline. My first thought was that someone had fallen, maybe slipped off a rock or twisted an ankle. We were in the middle of nowhere, and if someone needed help, we were probably the only ones close enough to do anything about it. "We should go check," I said, already moving toward the sound. Emily hesitated but followed. The path ahead twisted sharply, cutting through dense greenery. As we pushed forward, the screaming grew louder. It wasn't just fear in that voice. It was pure terror. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. Finally, we saw him. A man, barefoot, his clothes torn and dirty, was standing in the middle of the path. His chest rose and fell in ragged breaths. His face was streaked with sweat and dirt, his hair disheveled. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. His eyes darted around wildly, but the second he saw us, his whole body sagged with relief. He didn't speak at first, just staggered toward us and collapsed to his knees. I crouched beside him, my heart pounding. "Are you okay? What happened?" He tried to speak, but his throat was so dry that no words came out. I handed him my water bottle, and he gulped it down like a man who hadn't had a drink in hours. Emily and I exchanged a glance. He was clearly in shock. After a moment, he took a deep breath. "I got lost," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "I've been out here since yesterday morning. I didn't think I was going to make it." I exhaled, my own nerves still raw. "You're lucky we found you. We need to get you back. Can you walk?" He nodded weakly, though his legs trembled as he tried to stand. Emily moved to support him, and I took his other arm. As we started walking, I glanced at him again. There was something oddly familiar about his face, but I couldn't place it. Then, after a few moments of silence, he turned to me, his eyes still wide with exhaustion. "Where are you guys from?" "London," I said. "You?" He blinked. "No way. Me too." A strange feeling settled in my gut. "What part?" "Brixton." I felt a jolt. "I grew up in Brixton." He let out a weak, breathy laugh. "Jesus, small world." We continued on, our pace slow but steady. The jungle felt different now, less beautiful, more oppressive. The heat was unbearable, but we kept going, focused on getting this man back to safety. "What's your name?" I asked after a while. "Tom," he said. "Tom Harwood." The name hit me like a brick to the chest. My head snapped toward him. "Are you serious?" He gave me a wary look. "Yeah." "Why?" I almost laughed at the absurdity of it all. "You work for Jack Morrison, don't you?" His eyes widened. "Wait, how do you know Jack?" "He's my best friend. We've known each other since we were kids." Tom let out a stunned laugh, shaking his head. "This is insane. I mean, what are the odds? I get lost in the middle of a jungle in Costa Rica, and the guy who finds me lives less than a mile from me back home. It was beyond coincidence. The odds were astronomical, but at that moment, none of it mattered as much as getting out of that jungle. We walked for another hour, Tom growing steadier on his feet as he drank more water. Eventually, the dense trees began to thin, and the sound of distant cars told us we were finally near the main road. When we reached the edge of the jungle, Tom let out a deep, shuddering breath. "I thought I was going to die in there," he admitted. "I kept thinking no one would ever find me, that I'd just disappear." Emily squeezed his arm. "You're safe now." We flagged down a passing truck, explaining what had happened. The driver, a local, was kind enough to give Tom a ride back to the nearest town. As we watched the truck disappear down the road, Emily turned to me, shaking her head. "That was insane." I exhaled, still processing everything. "Yeah, insane is one word for it." We never saw Tom again after that. But a week later, when we got back home, I told Jack the whole story. He went pale when I mentioned Tom's name. "He never showed up for work that Monday," Jack said. "We thought maybe something had happened to him, but no one knew where he was. We figured he had just quit without telling anyone." I shuddered. "Well, now you know. He got lost in the jungle. Nearly died." Jack stared at me for a long moment, then muttered, "Jesus Christ." I nodded. "Yeah, that's about right." Even now, years later, I still think about it sometimes. How close Tom had come to dying. How impossible it was that we found him. How thin the line is between life and death. And how sometimes the universe just decides to throw two people together in the strangest of ways. And how, no matter how far you go, the world is never as big as you think it is. I was on a canoe camping trip with my wife, Sarah. It was mid-September, that perfect time of year when the days are still warm but the nights are crisp, and the summer crowds have mostly disappeared. We had planned a 3-day trip along Clearwater Lake, a long and narrow body of water stretching through the thick, untouched forests of northern Minnesota. It was our last big trip before the weather turned too cold for comfort. We had paddled for hours that day, moving steadily along the lake, stopping here and there to stretch our legs, eat, and enjoy the silence of the wilderness. There was no cell service out here, which we both found refreshing. Just us, the canoe, and the vast, quiet woods. We set up camp on a flat clearing about halfway along the lake. There was a small, rocky beach where we could pull up the canoe, and thick trees shielded us from the wind. By the time we finished dinner, the sun had already dipped behind the tree line, casting long shadows across the lake. The temperature had dropped noticeably. Sarah was reading in the tent while I decided to wash up before calling it a night. I walked down to the water with my headlamp, the beam cutting through the darkness. The lake was still, barely a ripple disturbing its surface. Then I saw them, 2 lights on the opposite shore, about 50 meters away. They wavered slightly, bobbing as if whoever held them was moving. My first thought was that it must be other campers, but something felt off. They were too far from any established campsites. Most people would have set up well before dark. Then, as I watched, both lights flickered and died. The night swallowed the opposite shoreline in complete darkness. I stood there, frozen. Maybe their batteries had died? Maybe they had just turned them off? Then I heard something. A deep, guttural snorting sound, heavy and loud. Something big was over there, breathing heavily, moving through the trees. My first instinct was bear. Or moose. Either way, nothing you want to be too close to in the dead of night. The silence stretched on for too long, thick and unnatural. I cleared my throat, gathering my nerve, and called out, "Hey, you all right over there?" The response came almost immediately, loud enough to carry across the water. 2 voices, overlapping, rushed and shaken. They had taken the wrong trail, ended up on the wrong side of the lake, and now, without lights, they were stranded in the dark. Worse, whatever was snorting nearby had them too afraid to move. I didn't hesitate. I jogged back to the tent, grabbed an extra flashlight, and slid the canoe back into the water. The lake was dark and glassy, reflecting the faint glow of stars above. My paddle cut through the silence, the rhythmic strokes steadying my nerves. As I neared the opposite shore, I could hear them moving. A man and a woman, rustling in the undergrowth, their breathing uneven. The moment my light hit them, they rushed toward the shore. They were young, maybe early 20s, dressed in hiking gear. Both looked rattled, their faces pale in the glow of my headlamp. "Get in," I said, keeping my voice low. They didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled into the canoe, gripping the sides as I pushed us off the rocky shoreline. Just as we drifted away, that snorting sound came again, closer this time and louder. It wasn't a bear's huff or a moose's heavy breath. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. We didn't stick around to find out. The paddle back was tense. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the quiet splash of water against the canoe. I could feel them watching the shore behind us, their bodies stiff with fear. When we reached my campsite, I handed them the flashlight and let them catch their breath while they set up. They thanked me, their voices hushed, and I could tell they were relieved beyond words. If I hadn't been there, they would have had to backtrack for hours, stumbling in the dark, with whatever was lurking on that shore just out of sight. I didn't sleep well that night, not because of them, but because of the way that snorting sound had echoed in my head. I had spent enough time in the woods to know the sounds of its creatures, but this one stuck with me. The next morning, they left early, paddling off with hurried waves. I never caught their names. Sarah and I packed up later that afternoon, and as we pushed off from shore, I found myself glancing across the lake one last time. The trees stood silent, unmoving. Nothing was there, but I knew better. Something had been, and whatever it was, I hoped I never ran into it again. I was young and broke when I decided to spend the night in a forest, just outside a small town in Oregon. I had been traveling on foot for days, staying wherever I could. Sometimes a cheap motel, other times just a dry patch of ground where I could lay my sleeping bag. That night, I was too tired to care about anything but rest. The forest was thick, ancient trees rising high above, their rough bark twisted with time. The ground was soft, layered with fallen needles and damp earth. I found a spot that felt safe enough, a flat clearing beneath a massive tree, where the roots curled like fingers around the dirt. I spread out my blanket, thick enough to keep the cold away but thin enough that I could still feel the ground beneath me. Then I rolled out my sleeping bag, cocooning myself in layers to ward off the night chill. The air smelled of pine and damp wood, the scent settling in my lungs as I let my exhaustion pull me under. I don't know what woke me. Maybe it was the sudden silence, or the way the air felt thick, heavy. My breath came slow and steady, my body unwilling to move, still caught between sleep and waking. But something felt off. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers brushing over the cool metal before clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the edge of my blanket. And that's when I saw them, a ring of spiders, their long, spindly legs stretched out, forming an unbroken perimeter around me. Dozens of them, maybe more. Each one stood still, facing outward, as if they were guarding me. My chest tightened. I had seen spiders before. Small ones in corners, larger ones skittering across walls, but never like this. Never this many, never this still. I didn't move, didn't breathe, just watched. Their bodies were dark, their legs like thin strands of wire, their small bodies still almost mechanical. They weren't moving, weren't creeping toward me, just waiting. For what? I swallowed hard, my heartbeat drumming in my ears. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe they were hunting, waiting for some unlucky insect to crawl into their trap. Maybe they were drawn to the warmth of my body, though they didn't seem interested in me at all. I thought about shaking my blanket, scattering them away, but the idea of seeing them scatter in every direction made my stomach turn. So I did nothing, just slowly, carefully, pulled the blanket tighter around myself, making sure no gaps remained. I turned off the flashlight, shutting my eyes tight, willing myself back to sleep. It wasn't easy. The weight of their presence pressed in on me, making every breath feel too loud, too risky. I counted the seconds, then the minutes. Eventually, exhaustion won out. When I woke again, it was morning. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting golden streaks on the ground. I hesitated before moving, my mind still half-trapped in the night before. But when I finally sat up, there was nothing. No spiders, no sign they had ever been there. I scanned the blanket, the ground around me, searching for even a single strand of web, a stray leg, anything to prove to myself that it hadn't been a dream. But there was nothing, just empty space where they had once stood. I packed up my things slowly, my body still stiff with the remnants of unease. As I folded the blanket, I found myself glancing around, half expecting them to return. But the forest was still, the only movement coming from the breeze rustling the leaves. I left that place without looking back. It was just spiders, I told myself, just a strange, eerie thing that happened. But even now, years later, when I close my eyes and think back to that night, I still see them, lined up, waiting. For what? I'll never know. I don't know why I thought a solo trip in the middle of nowhere was a good idea. Maybe I wanted to prove something to myself. Maybe I just wanted to be alone. Whatever the reason, I found myself deep in the backwoods of northern Minnesota, just me and my little tent on the edge of the forest, looking down onto a rocky shoreline. It was late September, a time when the leaves were already turning, a crisp chill clinging to the air, but not quite enough to bring snow yet. The days were cool, the nights colder, and the woods stretched on endlessly, dark and deep, nothing but miles of trees and silence, except for the occasional rustling of wind through the branches or the call of a distant bird. The first night was always the worst. Took me a while to settle, to get used to the endless noise of the woods. It wasn't that I hadn't camped alone before. I had. But something about that first night always made my nerves raw, my senses too sharp. Every snapping twig sounded like a footstep. Every gust of wind rattling the branches made me brace for some unseen threat. I had set up camp on a flat patch of land just before the tree line ended. My tent positioned so that I could look out onto a small slope leading down to the water. The lake stretched out in front of me, a dark and silent expanse, the occasional ripple breaking the surface. It should have been peaceful, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my stomach as soon as the sun went down. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The woods were alive, but my mind twisted the sounds, turning them into something else. The snap of a branch became the careful step of a man. The rustling of leaves became the whisper of someone moving closer. I told myself it was just animals. Raccoons, maybe, a fox passing through, a deer. But then I heard something heavier, something deliberate. Footsteps. I stopped breathing, my ears straining in the darkness. My heart was in my throat, beating so hard I swore whoever was out there could hear it. It wasn't just an animal foraging. It wasn't a rabbit hopping through the underbrush. It was heavy, slow, and purposeful. A branch snapped closer this time, then another, followed by the distinct crunch of something stepping on dry leaves. I felt my whole body go rigid. My sleeping bag suddenly felt suffocating, too tight around my legs. I wanted to sit up, but I was terrified of making noise, of letting whoever or whatever was out there know that I was awake. I thought about reaching for my knife, but my fingers were frozen, gripping the fabric of my sleeping bag so tightly my knuckles ached. Then, just outside my tent, a sudden crash. It was loud, something big hitting the ground, followed by the sharp clatter of rocks tumbling down the slope onto the beach. I sucked in a breath. Silence. The footsteps had stopped. My mind raced through possibilities. If it was a person, they had just fallen. If it was an animal, it had slipped. Either way, something was right outside my tent. I forced myself to move, slowly, carefully reaching for my flashlight. My fingers were shaking so badly I could barely find the switch. But when I did, I hesitated. I didn't want to turn it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. Another rock tumbled down the slope. That did it. I clicked on the flashlight and unzipped the tent door just enough to peek outside. My breath caught in my throat. A massive elk lay sprawled on the rocky beach below, legs tangled awkwardly beneath its body, stunned but alive. It must have lost its footing on the slope and taken a hard fall, sending rocks flying in the process. For a moment, I just stared, heart still hammering from the fear that had gripped me only seconds before. The elk groaned, shifting slightly, dazed from the fall. I let out a shaky breath. Not a person, not a monster, just an animal. The fear that had held me in a vice slowly released its grip, leaving me exhausted. I watched the elk struggle to its feet, its large, dark eyes reflecting the beam of my flashlight for a moment before it turned and disappeared back into the trees, crashing through the underbrush as it went. I sat there for a long time after it was gone, my body still trembling from the leftover adrenaline. The woods felt quieter now, as if they, too, had been holding their breath. I eventually crawled back into my sleeping bag, still feeling the phantom echoes of fear in my chest. It took me a long time to fall asleep, but when I did, I dreamed of nothing but the sound of hooves on stone and the endless, watching trees.